Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the annual thesis presentations of students pursuing an honors degree in international and public affairs. I just said pursuing, but I really should have said receiving an honors degree. So big congratulations to everyone. This year, all 18 students in the honors program, all 18 who have presented, presented yesterday and will present today, which is about, if I think I'm correct, about 11% of the IAPA graduating class will receive an honors degree. I'd like to welcome all of you, friends, family, faculty in the room, as well as those who are joining us by live stream from around the world. I'm Claudia Elliott from the Watson Institute, and I teach along with Professor Anya Bassett, one of the two mandatory thesis seminars that these students had to endure. I'm speaking about my own class, last fall. I've been teaching that seminar for a long time. I've been involved in the honors program for a long time, actually going back to a year that begins and ends with a 2 and has 2 zeros in the middle. So you can see how long I've been at this. Today's conference marks the culmination of the IAPA honors program for the class of 2024. And as such, it's not only a celebration, but a display of the extraordinary quality, creativity, and interdisciplinary research conducted by IAPA concentrators. As we saw yesterday, their projects are interesting, they are intellectually stimulating, their topics are timely. All of their topics are front page news around the globe. We could, just to name a few, migration, education, climate, human rights, national security, the problems of drug addiction and how to handle it, poverty, inequality, and more. But perhaps most importantly, they represent their passion for and commitment to gaining a deep understanding of complex global and local issues. And in many cases, they make a serious effort to do something about them. The presentations yesterday were professional, authoritative, compelling, and I'm certain today we'll see the same thing. However, it was no small feat to get to this point. Writing a thesis, doing original research is a year-long challenge of ups and downs, sometimes frustrating, returning to the drawing board, writing and rewriting, all couched within what I think I could say, a nervous excitement about making a contribution to our knowledge, about bringing something new, something fresh to the existing scholarly and policy conversations. These are their research questions, their intellectual framing, their research designs, their decisions regarding what constitutes evidence, their research findings, and their interpretation of the study's broader implications, what the conclusions mean for scholars, practitioners, advocates, indeed for all of us. Collectively, their work demonstrates the ability to work across a wide range of disciplines or disciplinary perspectives from history, political science, sociology, anthropology, economics, even in comparative literature and language studies, as well as a variety of methods, single case studies, comparative work, longitudinal analysis, multivariate regressions, ethnography, quantitative and qualitative textual analysis, and even the creation of new conceptual frameworks. According to an article in the New Yorker a few years ago, celebrating the English translation of Umberto Eco's famous 1977 essay, How to Write a Thesis, in the process of writing a thesis, we become equipped for a world outside ourselves, a world of ideas, philosophies, and debates. I think it's fair to say that these students are forever changed, both intellectually and personally, by this process, not least of which is that they've become more conscientious thinkers, writers, and communicators in ways that will serve them well beyond their time at Brown. Indeed, I suggest if there's one thing those of you who are in the honors program will remember after Brown, long after you've forgotten about your professors or what classes you took, it will be the thesis. So I'm looking forward to hearing from all three panels today. For me, these are the best 2 days of the year, and I hope they are the same for you. And without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Bassett up to introduce the first panel. And before that, just a minor scheduling change. Panel 3 is just going to begin about 10 minutes later. So I think at 2:20. Thank you.
Anya Bassett, Faculty Director of International and Public Affairs and Director of Undergraduate Teaching and Learning. And I would just like to start with an apology. I created the schedule, and this is why you're all noting that I am a qualitative social scientist, not a quantitative primarily. I can do a little stats, but obviously not that well. Without further ado, I am delighted to be able to announce and moderate the first panel. A quick reminder about how we do this. Each panelist speaks for 10 minutes to present their work, including the slides, and then we will have 20 minutes of Q&A from the audience. And as I did yesterday, I will do the same thing. Thesis writing, academic work is like a relay race. Where the academics who come before you, the scholars who come before you, run that race. They pass the baton to you. You carry the baton for a little while, and then you pass it off to the next set of scholars, maybe your future self. And so I will start the Q&A with asking, and you are all been prepped for this, where will you pass the baton next? If you were going to turn it over to the next person or to yourself, what would you be doing next? So you can think about that. So the three panelists today, the first is Alice Joe, Whose Public Memory? Pandemic Archives in New York City and the Dilemmas of Representation. The second panelist is Saloni Singh, Reassessing Repatriation and Resettlement, the U.S. Negotiations over the detainees in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And the third is Isa Stronsky, The Politics of Peace Education, Schooling as a Vehicle for Reconciliation or Division After Violent Ethnic Conflict in Bosnia and Rwanda. And panelists, I will hold up a little white card when you have 2 minutes left, and when you see the red card, that means okay. So there you go. Alice, to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alice Joe. After spending 3 semesters of college on Zoom, I became a research assistant for the Pandemic Journaling Project here at Brown. This initiative was one of many around the world that encouraged people to document life during the pandemic through journal entries, images, physical ephemera, and other mediums. The goal was to create the history of COVID-19 and ensure that it will be shaped by a diverse range of voices and not solely defined by the powerful or by the statistics that dominated official records and news cycles at the time. Unlike previous health crises with sparse archival records, such as the forgotten flu pandemic of 1918, our own public memory of COVID-19 could be shaped by sources recorded by people in their own words. My thesis investigates public memory institutions, or libraries, archives, and museums that we trust to provide information as a public good, and how they sought to document the pandemic's impacts across different communities. I define public memory as a shared process of deciding what is important to remember, and archives are central to this process. In creating pandemic archives, institutions aim to document the pandemic in real time as comprehensively as possible. Given the limited resources and challenging circumstances of the pandemic, it was inevitable that some people's stories were selectively recorded over others. How then did public memory institutions try to represent a diversity of perspectives in their pandemic archives? And what can we learn about creating representative archives equitably and ethically? I argue that the intentions of the project organizers regarding the archive's primary audience and uses influence their process for collecting diverse perspectives within their communities. Archives are sites of struggle over power and public memory. It follows then that public memory institutions not only have a role in preserving history, but actively shaping the narratives that current and future publics can learn from. My thesis joins debates in critical archival studies and memory studies about how traditional archives and institutions have historically centered the voices of white, male, and heteronormative perspectives above those of marginalized groups, thereby perpetuating forms of oppression and inequalities rooted in the way knowledge is produced across social differences like race, gender, sexuality, disability, and class. My study examines how 3 established public memory institutions tried to reckon with these power imbalances through their pandemic archives in a time when their doors were closed and they were pressured to join local and global conversations centered around equity. While numerous studies have reported on institutional efforts to archive the pandemic, few interview key figures involved to study how their motivations and intentions informed their process of collecting perspectives. My research involved a comparative analysis of 3 initiatives in New York City, the epicenter of the pandemic in the US in the spring of 2020. I chose the Queens Memory Community Archiving Program, the New York Historical Society's History Response Initiative, and New York Public Library's Pandemic Diaries Project. All 3 demonstrated leadership in documenting their community's experiences most actively during the first year of the pandemic. Through interviews with key project staff and analyses of outreach materials, online panels, and press coverage, I identified themes related to how these projects conceptualize diversity and representation and tried to implement them in practice. The 3 projects used crowdsourcing, or open calls for people to submit their stories online, and targeted outreach to specific groups of people, such as frontline workers, students, small businesses, protesters, grassroots community aid efforts, and more. Queens Memory approached their project as a public service by and for residents in the New York City borough of Queens to process the pandemic in real time. They emphasized the leadership of community members in archiving digital materials and oral histories. New York Historical Society took a curatorial approach, selectively collecting digital and physical materials around themes they wanted to highlight for current and future researchers and museum audiences. New York Public Library saw its project collecting oral histories primarily as a resource for future research, enhancing their reach through partnerships with community organizations. Across the case studies, I found that in order to balance the objectives of creating diverse collections with equity and care in mind, institutions strive to provide multiple access points to meet communities where they were through strategies such as multilingual outreach across different digital platforms. And institutions strive to build trusting relationships with community leaders and organizations to enhance participation. And institutions strive to empower people to share their stories on their terms and provide their own context, while protecting their privacy, such as details about health information and involvement in protest movements. These practices highlight the need for institutions to be adaptable, to actively identify and engage with underrepresented communities. and meet them where they are in order to balance the duty to collect stories from as many perspectives as possible with a duty to respect their wishes and well-being of those being documented. As we continue to navigate the aftermath of the pandemic, we need to be intentional about bearing witness to our collective experiences in inclusive ways. This process is about actively including community members so they can have a say over how they represent themselves. During my interviews, I recognized the importance of transparency and accountability that must accompany efforts to make systemic changes. This was a study of how archives and public memory institutions must critically examine their own practices and how they can create spaces that affirm belonging for more people. Since 2020, COVID-19 has led to the deaths of millions around the world with extremely uneven impacts. And yet it feels like we haven't really reckoned with those losses. Stories from pandemic archives can be used to catalyze decision makers in public health and other critical areas to adopt more responsive and equitable policy measures. This thesis was also an effort to resist the impulse to rush past the pandemic and engage with how its impacts should be remembered and addressed. I hope that witnessing stories in these archives will help us go beyond summarizing the lessons learned to make meaningful changes in policy and culture that address the inequities exposed by COVID-19, its ongoing effects, and how we can better care for each other during and beyond times of crisis. And I want to thank Professors Steve Lubar, Daniel Smith, and Anya Bassett for guiding me through this project. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, I'm Saloni, and this is my thesis, Reassessing Repatriation and Resettlement, the U.S. Negotiations at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. I became interested in this topic after a research project I conducted in Geneva, where I interviewed aid practitioners and litigators to better understand the detainee experience at Guantanamo. And while I walked away with a better understanding of the legal challenges surrounding how detainees arrive and what they experience at the detention facility, I found a gap in the literature around the process of how they leave. I became interested in understanding how negotiations between seemingly unrelated stakeholders could determine the fate of a detainee. This thesis investigates that gap. To begin, a detainee is an individual that has been incarcerated or accused and awaiting judgment. Their fate is often in the hands of warring governments, and it remains in limbo for a very long time. They are captured by enemy forces, and they are stripped of their freedoms. But thanks to international norms and the Geneva Conventions, there are stipulations in place to ensure that prisoners of war are repatriated or sent to their home country at the end of a conflict. But what is supposed to occur when a war doesn't have a definite end? When it's a forever war? Or what we know of as today, the war on terror? This brings us to our central puzzle. The lack of a definite end to the war on terror precludes Guantanamo Bay detainees from being granted prisoner of war status, which comes with certain benefits and privileges, such as the basic guarantee to return to your home country after hostilities have ceased. And for some context, Guantanamo Bay was opened in 2002 as a failed post-9/11 counterterrorism measure. Roughly 780 detainees from 48 different countries have been detained there, and it has since then been infamously proven that the majority were innocent. In fact, 86% of detainees at Guantanamo were captured by warlords in Pakistan and Afghanistan by people who were promised large sums of money and bounties by the US military for handing over people who looked suspicious. So now that we know there are no international norms governing this case, detainees have to be transferred through complex repatriation and resettlement deals that are negotiated with the US. And as you go down the list of citizenship countries and transfer countries here, you'll begin to see that the orders shift. And one thing is clear: detainees are not originated back to the countries that they are nationals of. This unprecedented case also offers valuable contributions to the theoretical framework with which we understand negotiation and bargaining theory, and therefore, my research builds on negotiation, bargaining, and complex interdependence theories to insert and reassess Guantanamo in a theoretical framework. So first, I asked the broader question: how do states negotiate the transfer of a detainee? To answer this, I studied historical post-war negotiations, such as the aftermath of the Vietnam War, the Korean War, and Yugoslavia post-World War II. And I found a central gap. Essentially, there were no conventional models that explained how unconventional conflicts where detainees are not considered prisoners of war should be handled. This led me to ask the specific question in which my thesis is grounded in, which is what are the processes and mechanisms that discover and explain and affect these US negotiations over the remaining detainees at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And as evidenced by the facts displayed on the screen, there have been hundreds of negotiations that have occurred for there to be only 30 remaining today from the original number of 780. Therefore, this thesis not only provides and informs future transfers for the remaining detainees, but it provides a novel understanding of how the international community approaches these transfers. To answer these questions, I first use a qualitative comparative case study method. These subcases are countries that have negotiated with the US over detainees. First, we have the case of Albania, which represents a case of resettlement, or when a detainee is not able to return to their home country and therefore resettled to a third-party country. And I've chosen Albania because Albania resettled Uyghur Muslim detainees when the US refused to repatriate them back to China. And second, we have Saudi Arabia, a subcase of repatriation, which is a country that has had hundreds of its nationals returned back to their country. And these two subcases represent important variation among factors such as regime type, relationship with the US, and what geopolitical incentive there might be for accepting a detainee. And second, I use process tracing to show how the US and its negotiating partner reached a decision. I refer primarily to diplomatic cables, which are classified internal communications from the US State Department. They were released in the infamous Cablegate leak by WikiLeaks in 2010, and this unauthorized release exposed 25,000 covert exchanges, therefore offering an unprecedented glimpse into how governments communicate what concessions and bargaining requests they will make when taking in a detainee. My analysis was conducted by filtering communications between embassies in the US and embassies in Albania, namely Tirana, and in Saudi Arabia, mostly Riyadh. These cables have yet to be spotlighted in the study of detainee negotiations, but I argue that they provide an unvarnished look into when detainees are prioritized and when they remain pawns in larger geopolitical contests. And when triangulated with NGO reports, media coverage, and press releases, what emerges is a comprehensive picture that proves when states value bigger concessions over the return of detainees. Challenging theoretical assumptions, I hypothesized that negotiating actors were prioritizing external factors over human rights, which therefore affected the negotiation process. And this brings me to my findings. I found that these negotiations were heavily influenced by factors such as geopolitical pressure, domestic and international perception, and maintaining precedent. While there are many ways these three factors emerged throughout the cables and my other evidence, I would like to focus on an example of two and begin by illustrating an example of geopolitical pressure, which specifically arose through the case of Uyghur Muslim detainees. In 2006, Albania agreed to resettle 5 Uyghur Muslims who were innocent, yet detained at Guantanamo Bay for several years. The US cited clear human rights concerns over repatriating them back to the countries of which they were nationals, which was China, and negotiated with Albania to therefore resettle these detainees. However, the cables revealed that once Albania agreed to resettle these detainees, they began to face threats of diplomatic and economic retaliation from China, which demanded that their nationals be repatriated back to them so that they could try them in their own court of law and potentially arrest them despite them being cleared for transfer. Therefore, despite these negotiations occurring most prominently between the US and Albania, what emerged was China as the most prominent driver of these negotiations, a country that is not linked to the conventional scholarship on Guantanamo at all. And second, an example of perception. In the cables, Saudi Arabia leveraged a rehabilitation center that it had specifically opened to re-educate and de-radicalize Guantanamo Bay detainees. This was to demonstrate a commitment to the US of their continued efforts of counterterrorism, which, given the post-9/11 climate in America, was very effective. However, Saudi officials in the cables portrayed this center almost as draconian. They promised to continue monitoring and tracking detainees long after they were returned to their home country, despite their innocence being proven. However, this was an effective bargaining chip for the US, and therefore many Saudi Arabian detainees have been repatriated back to their country. As the quotes show, these are just two of the many examples and ways I found how Guantanamo negotiations transcend the current bilateral model. And this negotiation context provides a potential important explanation for why detainees continue to be surveilled, abused, or even arrested after their transfer. Detainee transfers have immediate human consequences. These findings inform future negotiations for the 30 detainees still languishing in captivity today by informing and pointing out which frameworks within this negotiation model were inefficient. Second, it also highlights important contributions to theory and the need for our traditional models of negotiation and bargaining to incorporate power symmetries, to account for geopolitical pressures and potential third-party stakeholders. And third, it provides several important policy recommendations that are generalizable to future cases of detainee transfers. To name one example, to demonstrate commitment and trust, nations seeking out other countries to resettle detainees that they have imprisoned themselves should first make an effort to resettle and rehabilitate those detainees, rather than solely vying for third-party transfers. I'd like to end with a quote from a memoir that I read when I first became interested in understanding how detainees articulate this experience themselves. In Don't Forget Us Here, Mansour Adefi writes, "I was shipped out of Guantanamo in the same way I was shipped in. Against my will, gagged, blindfolded, hooded, ear-muffed, and shackled. Detainee transfer is a double-edged sword. It can liberate or oppress. And the power of negotiation is an incredibly important tool, but it must be tempered by a consideration of those whose lives hang in the balance." Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Isa Stronsky, and today I will be presenting my thesis, The Politics of Peace Education, Schooling as a Vehicle for Reconciliation or Division After Violent and Ethnic Conflict in Bosnia and Rwanda. Before I start, I would like to thank my primary advisor, Omer Bartov, my second reader, Professor Pierre Delgabert, as well as my senior seminar professor, Anya Bassett, and my thesis cohort. To start, I will say a few more general words about the intersection of education and peace building that I examined in my thesis. Conflict of any kind places significant stress on public education systems. Beyond material costs that include the destruction of school buildings, loss of teaching personnel, and lack of sufficient funding post-conflict, Civil wars, in particular, leave behind a contentious and divisive legacy that pose significant challenges to the ideological and social rehabilitation of post-war education systems. Often referred to as the process of molding young minds, the nature of education after conflict plays a significant role in determining how a nation's legacy of violence informs the cultural and political attitudes of future generations. While pedagogical approaches to violent conflict carry out the unique potential to teach peace and reconcile historically divided populations, education is also vulnerable to political manipulation for less altruistic means. In the U.S. today, we see the role of polarizing politics in education and vice versa, in campus advocacy responding to the current conflict between Israel and Palestine, and book banning in states such as Texas and Florida, to name a few. In a world plagued by numerous civil and ethnic conflicts, questions of how to deter the recurrence of such hostilities in nations emerging from war is highly prevalent. Now, when examining the relationship between education, politics, and peace building after violent conflict, I chose to focus on the case studies of Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Rwanda. Both of these countries experienced violent and ethnically driven civil wars in the first half of the 1990s. In Rwanda, a campaign led by a Hutu extremist government sought to eradicate the minority Tutsi population and resulted in a 100-day genocide between April 7th and July 15th, 1994, during which an estimated 1 million Tutsi and moderate Hutu were killed. In Bosnia, after the dissolution of the former Yugoslavia in 1992, a civil war sparked between the state's three major ethnic groups, the Serbs, Bosniaks, and Croats, as these groups fought to form their own ethnically homogeneous nation-states by ridding their desired region of opposing groups. This war lasted from April 1992 to December 1995 and resulted in the death of about 100,000 civilians and combatants. While both Rwanda and Bosnia experienced similar types of conflict during overlapping time frames, these countries developed what are essentially opposite education policies for engaging with their respective national pasts. In Rwanda, after a 13-year moratorium on history instruction during which the government rewrote the history textbooks to purge them of discriminatory history teaching, as well as anything that was deemed to carry the potential to incite genocidal ideology in the future, they implemented a new history curriculum that presented a single narrative of Rwanda's past that was uniformly implemented across Rwandan schools, which were then integrated to include students of both ethnicities. This implementation was carried through a centralized education system dictated by an authoritarian government in Rwanda. Bosnia, on the other hand, enabled by a decentralized democratic government, maintained its three competing ethnic-specific curricula developed during wartime, which are taught in schools that remain segregated by ethnicity. The clear differences in these two nations' education policies pertaining to their national histories led me to wonder what caused Bosnia and Rwanda to develop such different approaches to post-war education after emerging from similar conflicts around the same time. I was particularly interested in the impact that political structure had in the development of these policies, as Rwanda subscribes to a highly centralized authoritarian structure, whereas Bosnia utilizes a decentralized democratic system. This prompted my research questions. How do Bosnia's and Rwanda's education policies reflect the influence and intent of their new regimes? And to what extent does each nation's curricula for culturally sensitive topics, and this would include history and language, reflect a commitment to the main goals of transitional justice? To evaluate the extent to which each country's post-war curricula maintains transitional justice initiatives, I used a framework based on what I determined to be the four quote-unquote big goals of transitional justice relative to my inquiry. These goals were to, one, create a break with the past, which would be to clearly differentiate the pre-war period and the war period with the post-war period, democratic consolidation, pursuit of peace and stability, and ultimately leading to reconciliation. So evaluating both Bosnia and Rwanda's post-war education systems, curriculums, policies regarding integrated versus segregated schooling, Using these 4 goals as metrics, I found that Bosnia and Rwanda presented a mutually exclusive relationship between the transitional justice goals of creating a break with the past and democratic consolidation. So while Rwanda has successfully implemented a curriculum that clearly differentiates the post-genocide period from the pre-genocide period, this curriculum emphasizes the importance of, quote, living in harmony, as described in the Rwandan textbooks, and teaches one national Rwandan identity in place of the ethnic categories that defined Rwandan society before and during the genocide. The implementation of this single narrative history curriculum was only possible because the authoritarian nature of Rwanda's government paved the way for its implementation by censoring critics who, if they were to advocate for a multi-perspective history curriculum, would risk being prosecuted for inciting ethnic tensions, which have recently become increasingly synonymous with disagreeing with Kagame, who has been the president of Rwanda for the past 30 years. In Bosnia, the inverse of this relationship occurs. Within a decentralized democratic structure, ethno-national leaders preserve their own power, much like Kagame is able to preserve his power through the single narrative of Rwandan history curriculums, by entertaining the lack of public will to integrate schools and curriculums in Bosnia. Instead, a democratically selected education system simulates the continuation of war by continuing to use curriculums developed during the 1992 to 1995 conflict and teaching ethnic-specific histories in the language of students' own ethnic group. This teaching is carried out through classrooms that remain segregated today. In both cases, this mutually exclusive relationship poses a risk to long-term peace and stability and reconciliation in these nations. Because these policies serve to support the current national powers in Bosnia and Rwanda, greater responsibility falls on the international community to advocate for and advise reform efforts while still acknowledging and honoring the sovereignty of each nation. To close, I'll make a quick note on what these implications matter outside of the context of Bosnia and Rwanda. So, politicization and weaponization of education poses a risk in any country with a diverse population grappling with questions of minorities, whether it be race relations, language, immigration, or so forth, regardless of whether or not it is transitioning from a conflict or currently amidst a conflict. Recognizing the strengths and weaknesses of Bosnia's and Rwanda's post-war education policies may help inform future scholars and politicians' efforts to design education policies in other contexts with the aim of ultimately achieving transitional justice goals of sustainable peace and reconciliation. Thank you.
These were terrific. What a great way to start our second day of the colloquium. All right, so let's talk about batons and relay races. Alice, do you want to start out? What's the next step? Where would you go, or where do you encourage future scholars to go?
Yeah, so when I began my project, I wanted to ask the question, how did these projects or institutions did they do what they set out to do, which is document diverse perspectives and kind of use the collections or analyze them to see what aspects of diversity could be measured. But I found that the collections, which were supposed to be published in the past 2 years, they're still in the process of being cataloged. So I would like to kind of go back to these collections when they are published and publicly accessible, and find ways to kind of measure the different kind of diversity lenses, such as what are the ratios of gender represented or races represented in these collections. But at the same time, there is an issue of there's a concern that this is a sort of tokenizing process, or a way of seeing whether institutions kind of check these boxes of diversity rather than actually meaningfully including people in the process of archiving their own experiences. So I need to definitely continue to engage in those ethical dialogues of what it means to archive this experience.
Saloni.
Thank you for that question, Professor Bassett. I think if I was passing the baton to a future scholar, I would suggests that they explored and proved the causal link between the inefficiencies of the negotiations I showed today and longer-term detainee outcomes. So I say this because there's many cases of post-detainee transfer shortcomings in the livelihoods of these detainees. They're not given access to social services, they're unemployed, many of them suffer from PTSD and depression, and I hypothesize that a large part is due to the fact that these governments aren't providing robust social services when they're arguing for the transfer, which isn't a lot to ask for because historic cases of wartime negotiations have done this. This is solely a case we see when detainees are not given prisoner of war status. So I think accounting for that kind of study, which might be quantitative, which might interview 50, 60 detainees and ask about their experiences post-transfer to show that maybe there is a causal link between how negotiations overlook them. And I think that could be what compels a sense of urgency within policymakers, because we see that as why the issue persists for so long today.
Hi, yeah. So one thing that I would have liked to look into if I had had more time or was able to pursue this further in my thesis was I focused a lot on the impact of political structure in determining the construction of post-war education policies, but I would encourage future scholars to look at some of the other factors, primarily economic development and reliance on international aid. So some scholars have postulated that Bosnia should have a much better chance at implementing a successful peace education program because of its greater economic development in comparison to Rwanda. However, when we do look at these case studies today, we do see that Rwanda has imposed much more significant change, as opposed to Bosnia's education policies have remained relatively stagnant to where they were in 1995. So looking at whether economic development without the right political incentives or with varying reliance on international aid and the approval of the international community, whether or not that would affect whether that increased income is being used to pursue education reform or whether it provides increased security to maintain educational policies that may service those in power because they are not more reliant on an international community that may be pushing for reform.
Excellent, thank you. All right, questions from the audience? We have microphones going around. We need you to speak into the microphone so that the YouTube link, we're on air. Yes.
Great. First of all, thank you all so much for your presentation. I had a question for Saloni. In your slides, you showed kind of a reshuffling of the nations that detainees were resettled in. I'm just wondering how those nations were determined. Were they countries that had existing diplomatic relations with the U.S.? Is there some kind of political leverage involved? And then ultimately, how did you decide on your 2 case studies?
Thank you. That's a great question. And I think that part of what was so unprecedented about this case is that many of the countries that these detainees were being sent to didn't have an existing history of negotiation with the U.S. or an existing diplomatic relationship. So a case like Albania, for example, was decided upon because essentially these detainees, they didn't want them to be able to reintegrate into society as easy as possible. So they found maybe like a more adjacent European nation with a larger Muslim population, and that's how that country was decided upon. And then I also chose Saudi Arabia because I wanted to show an example of a country that has had long-standing diplomatic and military ties with the U.S. and has had a tumultuous relationship where there were so many bargaining concessions made, and there were very contentious asks, such as being able to continue to track detainees, which the U.S. essentially agreed to. But I think speaking to that larger chart and the way that those countries were shuffled, the 3 largest countries to take in detainees were Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Yemen. And that's in large part because those are the countries with the nationals that ended up being majority detained at Guantanamo. And I think that the push over time has lessened. When people were first pushing for resettlement, they wanted to ensure that these detainees went home. There was also a large internal push. I mean, a lot of this has to do with nationhood and press coverage, and people were demanding that their nationals come home. And so the US kind of went in with that push for the first few years, but we really lost momentum, after the Bush administration, especially with the current administration. There isn't really an urgency to be doing this anymore. It's not serving or affecting anyone's national security apparatus, and therefore these detainees have essentially been forgotten by the international community. But I would say that that's why those countries are reshuffling, because in the beginning there was a large push to be able to send nationals to their country of origin.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. All of these were great. I have a question for Izzy.
Isa.
Isa, sorry. The Federal Ministry of Education in Bosnia is notoriously weak, but there was a moment when you had the High Commissioner there for a while. So one question is, was there in Bosnia any attempt to create a uniform narrative for all three? And then conversely, in Rwanda, how much of the education materials that were produced entirely internally, and to what extent were they relying on sort of international models of peace and reconciliation in terms of the development of a new curriculum?
Yeah. So for the first part of that question, I would answer that with Bosnia, thanks to the Dayton Accords, which, looking back in my thesis, a lot of scholars actually cited the decentralized structure written in the Dayton Accords, which were the peace agreements reached in 1995, as one of the reasons why Bosnia has been able to maintain such a segregated and decentralized education system. So under that structure, the Republika Srpska, which is actually, so that is, it has a centralized structure, but it is a largely homogeneous state, so you have a largely Serb population there. So the curriculum that they are imposing there that reflects their population is reflecting a majority Serb population. And then in the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, it is decentralized based on a canton structure, and these cantons are largely dominated by ethno-national politicians who are preserving these ethno-national narratives. So while there have been efforts primarily by the international community to intervene and impose more uniform education policies, the UNESCO and UNDP has actually cited Bosnia's current education system as a significant threat to the future peace and stability of the nation. These reforms have been placated, but no actual tangible effects have taken place to actually implement them. The furthest steps taken to integrate schooling would be the two schools under one roof reform, which it moved from students being educated in completely separate school buildings, so now students of different ethnicities might attend school within the same school building, but they'll use different entrances to the school, and they'll learn from different ethnically specific curricula in separate classrooms taught by teachers of their own ethnicity among peers of their own ethnicity. So that remains highly segregated still. And then in Rwanda, as for the role of external versus internal actors in the development of this curriculum, so there were international actors who were involved in the development of Rwanda's curriculum. That was actually a really long process because it took a long time for people to reach certain compromises and agreement in what would accurately represent a peace-oriented narrative that Rwanda wanted to put forth and was okay with the international community. So while the international community did take part in that action, it was within the context of drawing from the input of teachers and scholars within Rwanda who were still within a very authoritarian system. And so scholars who were involved with that process, actually I was looking at some of their papers in my thesis who were reflecting back on that curriculum building process and had interviewed teachers after the process had finished who expressed that they did not feel comfortable fully expressing their personal views, and that they wish that there was a more multi-perspective narrative within textbooks that more accurately reflected the holistic or a holistic Rwandan history, but that they were afraid to do so for fear of prosecution or political repercussions.
Yes. Just a quick question. What exactly is the wartime curricula that you mentioned on the Bosnia and Herzegovina side?
Yeah,
That's
so
just interesting.
yeah. So during that 3-year civil war, these groups were largely segregated based on ethnicity because there was civil war occurring between ethnicities. So these curriculums were developed where they were taught within the specific language of that ethnicity, which scholars consider are really just dialects of one common language, but has really been sold as being completely separate languages and part of creating these this image of divide between these ethnic groups, and they learn different versions of history. So the Serb curriculum teaches a history that largely ignores the presence of the other ethnicities within that region. The Bosniak curriculum teaches a history that depicts the Serbs and Croats as aggressors and Bosniaks as perpetual victims, which also propagates this idea of collective victimhood. And in the end, there's a lot of just conflicting narratives in the interpretation of history that was developed and spread throughout this wartime period. And so rather than reforming those narratives to create a more unified recollection of history that is forward-looking, I would argue that Bosnia's curriculum, since they kept the curriculums that were developed during wartime, is much more backwards looking to a period of conflict and division and not achieving that break with the past, which would be that first transitional justice goal, whereas Rwanda's is forward-looking and largely ignores its divisive history in the past in the name of focusing on a future that is narrated by peace and unity, and so achieves that break with the past, but is done so via non-democratic methods.
Wonderful. I'd love to get a question for Isa. I mean, for Alice. Do you have a
I have a
question?
question for Alice.
You're wonderful.
Alice, I loved your presentation because it stressed the importance of archival practice in capturing memory, especially in relationship to a pandemic. You seem to, and you actually have, seem to challenge the theory and practice of archival practice and talk about new standards and new practices. Could you give us a little idea of the state of archival practice at the moment and how much it differs from what you talked about?
Yeah, for sure. I'm building on sort of a literature of that I started sort of since the 1960s when the sort of radical historian Howard Zinn gave a speech at the American Archivists Conference about like how archives are not neutral and we cannot continue to pretend that there are like not biases and things that go into how stories are collected and accessioned and decide to be kept or removed. And so there are sort of there's emerging literature among particularly feminist archival scholars and Black memory workers who are centering this sort of discussion of repairing historically exclusionary practices and ensuring that more people have the ability to kind of tell their own stories and access the public memory institutions that have previously not really served them. And so this sort of edition of Pandemic Archives, it builds on a tradition of digital archives and rapid response collecting initiatives that have been happening through for previous crises like 9/11 or the HIV/AIDS epidemic, where activists and community archivists are they are trying to change these power dynamics and include more ways for people to have their voices included in the archives.
Good, thank you.
Thanks, Professor Allen. Questions? Oh, Professor Elliott has one.
Hi, thanks. This is for also a follow-up to Alice.
It's a case selection question. So the three institutions that you selected, did you choose them because you knew they had these diversity in representation practices? Or, you're shaking your head, yes? And so, okay, so you knew that, and I think you said that you originally wanted to test perhaps their effectiveness, but couldn't do that. But you talked about how they were similar then, but how did they differ across the three?
Yeah, so the first one that I talked about, which was the Queen's Memory Community Archiving Program, it is a community archive which means that it's like produced by and for community members, but they have the expertise of professional archivists who are employed by public memory institutions like Queen's Public Library and Queen's College. And so they have this sort of dynamic of working together to diversify the collections and not just have archivists decide what is going to be in these archives and what is not. So the New York Historical Society and New York Public Library, the New York Historical Society took a more kind of, from the beginning, a curatorial approach. So they had a sort of wish list of people that they wanted to document and reach out to. Whereas the New York Public Library, they had a more kind of open, broad approach where they partnered with some organizations, including like the New York Department of Health and certain Latinx organizations to gain more multilingual perspectives. But I think the New York Historical Society was more of a sort of way to shape the story of the pandemic, and the New York Public Library and Queen's Memory, they were kind of more open to people telling them what they wanted to see represented in the archives.
Excellent. Thank you to this amazing panel. What a wonderful way to start. So by my math, and I'm happy to get into it, if we break until 1:20 and start the second panel 5 minutes early, we'll be done. We can finish that by 2:10, take another break, and then we will be back on track to start at 2:15 for the third panel. Anyone? And then at the end of that, Professor Pilati will deliver the final remarks. So thanks again to this wonderful panel. And we will take a little break and come back and start the next panel at 1:20.
Would you all like to come in, have a seat? I think we're about ready to get started. Oh. Okay, I think we're ready to begin panel number 2. If you weren't here at the beginning of today, I'm Claudia Elliott, a senior lecturer here at the Watson Institute, and I teach one of the 2 thesis preparation seminars in the fall. It is my great pleasure to introduce the panel number 2, entitled The Global Dynamics of National Identity and Unity. These are 2 huge concepts, so I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the panelists today. 2 of these students were in my seminar, so I know something about their work. First, we will hear from Eva Azazoglu, Across Borders and Beliefs, National Identity Formation Among Immigration or Immigrant Communities. Eva will be followed by Alex Lehman, Imagined Bodies in Imagined Communities, Reproducing the Nation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Finally, Spencer Shep will present his thesis entitled Legislating Language, the Effects of Multi-Level Governance on Regional Identity and National Unity. So. Eva.
Thank you all for being here today. My name is Eva, and I will present my thesis, Across Borders and Beliefs, National Identity Formation Among Immigrant Communities. Thank you to my advisor, Professor Omer Bartov, my second reader, Sonia Panson, my honors thesis seminar instructor, Professor Claudia Elliott, and of course, my fellow honors students. Thank you for making this thesis possible. My thesis is inspired by my own personal background as the daughter of a Turkish immigrant to Austria. I grew up hearing about the difficulties faced by Turkish communities in Germany and struggled with questions surrounding my own place in Austrian society. My time at Brown has only cemented my interest in studying questions of national identity and integration of immigrants. My research was driven by the following question: how do a nation's institutions influence the national identities of the descendants of immigrants? In order to answer this question, I investigated a narrower research question. How does the institutionalized role of religion influence the national identities of second and third generation Turkish immigrants in Germany? As the second question reveals, my research is based on a case study of Turkish immigrant communities in Germany. International migration is not a new phenomenon, but it is a rapidly growing one. In 2020, there were 280 million international migrants in the world. After immigrants arrive in their host country, integration policies regulate their education, language acquisition, and workforce participation. Integration policies have a pivotal effect on the experiences and identification of immigrants and their descendants in their host country. Their experiences in their new environment have a lot to do with how much they feel part of the country that they are living in. There are several important aspects of integration policy. These include citizenship, language, and religion. In my thesis, I chose to focus on religion as a key factor in influencing national identification. In order to understand current debates on this issue, I investigated scholarship in 3 areas. These are social identity, institutions and religion, and nationalism and national identity. I found that national identity construction influences a nation's treatment of minority groups and shapes its institutions. This, in turn, affects dynamics between majority and minority groups. My thesis adds to these academic conversations by linking immigrant national identity formation with host country national identity. My argument is outlined on this slide. National identity construction and social group dynamics mutually influence each other, and they interact with institutionalization processes that influence and are influenced by these national identification processes. Understanding these processes has important implications for integration policy. By understanding how and why immigrant groups identify, we can create more targeted policies that address specific issues. For example, if we find that religion plays a big part in pushing Turkish immigrants towards identifying with Turkey over Germany, we might try to create more inclusive religious policies. Additionally, these processes can also affect immigrant voting behavior, both in the origin country and in the destination country. This makes integration and national identification a political issue and not just a social one. I use triangulation to conduct my empirical research. This is because neither of my research methods are enough on their own to answer my research question, but together they provide very useful insights. I used a combination of content analysis and interviews. As part of the content analysis, I coded a software that analyzed text data from 648 news publications and political speeches that were published in German newspapers and government websites between 1993 and 2023. And as part of the content analysis, I conducted topic modeling and sentiment analysis. Topic modeling finds prevalent topics among the data, as well as information on the prevalence of certain topics over time. Sentiment analysis investigates the tone of a text source and classifies it as positive, neutral, or negative. Here as well, I investigated the tone of the text sources over time. As part of the interviews, I conducted semi-structured interviews with 12 members of the Turkish-German community that were born in Germany, aged between 16 and 48. I conducted conversations with them, where I asked them about their experiences living in Germany as the descendants of Turkish immigrants. The questions ranged from experiences at school and at work to experiences with religion and politics. An important observation from the content analysis is that discourse surrounding political and social integration of immigrants tends to be more likely to be emotional than discourse surrounding the role of Islam in Europe. Another important theme that emerged concerned the simultaneous feeling of belonging to both countries and the feeling of exclusion from both. It is important to note the complexity of the processes underlying the dynamics of belonging and exclusion, which is highlighted by the variety of viewpoints and identifications expressed by the interview subjects. Third, we can observe the theme of misrepresentation in religious as well as ethnic contexts, where Muslim Turkish immigrants are grouped with other Muslim and other ethnic groups by Germans. On one hand, this reinforces the phenomenon that we found in the content analysis, in which Islam is discussed in a pan-Muslim, pan-European context, rather than being specific to Turks in Germany. On the other hand, it is surprising, in the context of the content analysis, that interview participants seem to perceive a similar generalization on the sphere of ethnicity, which, in the content analysis, is more concentrated on Germany and Turkey specifically. In terms of the topic of cultural and religious identity, a dominant theme is the desire of Turkish Germans to engage with both cultures and to maintain their own culture in a country with different norms. Based on the case study of Turkish immigrants in Germany, we can generalize this to the complexity of perspectives and the nuances within immigrant communities. It is essential to recognize the variety of factors that influence the national identification of the descendants of immigrants, ranging from language and traditions at home and in religious contexts to discrimination and acceptance in education and the workplace. To isolate religious institutions as a major contributing factor, then, is challenging due to the interrelated nature of the formative experiences of descendants of immigrants in developing their national identities. Generalizing the findings from the case study, we can identify that a nation's media discourses both reflect and shape the perceptions of the general population towards an immigrant group. This, in turn, interacts with the identification processes present in these immigrant groups, whose feelings of belonging or exclusion are closely related to perceptions from the majority group. The implications of these findings for policy solutions is a final pivotal point. Treating immigrant communities as homogeneous populations would ignore the diversity within them, thereby limiting the effectiveness of policies that take this approach. While we can identify religion as an important factor, further research is required in order to be able to draw conclusions on the circumstances within which religious institutions are a major contributing factor to national identification of the descendants of immigrants. Based on my findings, policy recommendations lie mainly in the area of integration policy, but they also stretch into education and workplace policies. As we continue to navigate the complexities of national identity and integration, my research sheds light on the intricate interplay between religion and national identity, with the hopes of encouraging policymakers and community leaders to commit to fostering environments where diverse voices are not only heard, but also integral to the fabric of our societies. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Alex Lehman, and today I'll be discussing my thesis entitled Imagined Bodies in Imagined Communities, Reproducing the Nation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Before I begin, I'd like to extend heartfelt gratitude towards my extraordinary advising team, Professor Rose McDermott, Laura Acosta, and Professor Anya Bassett. Thank you. And to my amazing family, my mother, and my friends who are here today and every day for me. Without you, this could not have been possible. Patrons of Villa of Los describe it as calming, restful, and the perfect spot for a romantic evening. The Spa Hotel is located in Visegrad, a sleepy town nestled along Bosnia's Drina River. However, 30 years ago, in the throes of a war that ravaged the Balkans following the dissolution of Yugoslavia, the Villa of Los Hotel fulfilled a very different purpose: rape camp. 200 Bosniak women were held at the hotel, repeatedly raped and tortured. And unfortunately, this incident was not an isolated one. Rather, it was part and parcel of a broader, strategic, and militarized campaign to effectuate a greater Serbia, of which reproductive coercion and rape was a significant element. In the wake of the Bosnian War, competing narratives about what really happened have emerged, as poignantly illustrated by the continued operations of Villa of Los. The hotel's beds where women were raped, the swimming pool where bodies were piled, remains intact and in use. And when asked about Villa of Los, Visegrad's tourism department director dismissed the claims as exaggerated and unfair, instead stating, "We are trying to forget about the war years and develop tourism." Why do we have to keep talking about the past? My thesis responds to this question, affirming both the necessity and malleability of post-war memory. I employ Benedict Anderson's theory of the imagined community to explore the production of national mythologies and collective memory. I look to legal processes as a crucial forum through which crimes, claims, and victimhood are articulated, mediated, and enshrined. I'm interested in exploring trials that occurred beyond Bosnia's borders, to derive insights into the development of international law, as well as looking at the reshaping of an externalized Bosnian identity within a contemporary geopolitical context. I then apply a gender lens paying particular attention to crimes of a sexual and gendered nature that were so central to this war. Encapsulated by the term imagined bodies, I understand gender as constructed and enacted, drawing heavily on feminist scholarship ranging from Butler to McKinnon to Kristeva, and I seek to identify the specific frames utilized during these trials that facilitated legibility, empathy, and grievability. A non-legal example of such a frame comes in the form of Miss Besieged Sarajevo, the beauty queen pictured on my first title slide, where the power of beauty provided a mechanism to galvanize the international community to pay attention to the war. But in this thesis, I look to legal trials as a form of political theater, and I ask what cast of characters emerge. To do so, I first traveled to Bosnia last spring, and I had the incredible opportunity to visit Sarajevo, Potocari, and Mostar, which allowed me to conduct on-the-ground ethnographic research, including interviews, participant observation, and photography, which I include throughout my thesis. This facilitated unique insights into memory as an active project, one requiring maintenance, collective participation, and rife with subjectivity. I then turned to legal frames analysis, which constituted the bulk of my thesis's scholarly contribution. I looked at 3 cases, all relatively understudied, that were tried in jurisdictions outside of Bosnia and set important precedent. These cases were Kadic vs. Karadzic, Mothers of Srebrenica versus the Netherlands and the UN, and the Prosecutor versus Furingia. I parsed over 1,000 pages of court documents, transcripts, opinions, amicus briefs, and I devote a chapter to each case, looking closely at the language, form, content, and cadence of these trials. I trace legal innovations, implications for national identity, and most centrally, constructions of gender. To answer the first facet of my research question, I posit the novel claim that the legal proceedings in the wake of the Bosnian War acted as a form of prosthetic memory. This is a term coined by Alison Landsberg to describe cultural technologies, like movies or museums, that create, quote, privately felt public memories of historical events, even those for which one was not present. I argue that law, through both the staging of trials, spectacularized and experiential, and archival preservation, particularly through digital mediums, provide transferential sites for the creation and dissemination of this prosthetic memory, with the capacity to transcend geographic and temporal divides. I'll briefly discuss the 3 cases I looked at and describe the outcomes and the gender frames I derived. So first we have the Kadic case, which was a class action civil suit brought under the Alien Tort Claims Act in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York, an unlikely forum. But the plaintiffs were a group of Bosniak women who were suing the former president of Republika Srpska for genocide, rape, and torture. It was initially dismissed by the district court on grounds of lacking subject matter jurisdiction. It was brought up on appeal to the Second Circuit, where the judgment was reversed, was returned to the lower court, and Karadzic was found liable, and the plaintiffs were awarded $745 million in damages. However, this was largely a symbolic victory. The money is very unlikely to reach the plaintiffs, as Karadzic is currently serving a life sentence in The Hague. But we saw this broadening collective frame of women as a class emerge, one that proved effective for its inclusivity, if not specificity. We then turned to the Mothers case, which was another civil suit brought before the District Court of The Hague by an organization representing those slaughtered during the Srebrenica genocide. Using tort law to sue the Dutch government and the UN for failure to prevent the massacre, the court found that the UN enjoyed absolute immunity, but did find the Netherlands liable for damages. This was ultimately appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, where that percentage of liability was actually decreased. The litigation did not acknowledge the sexual violence that was present during the genocide, instead relying on the more politically palatable and potent frame of tragic maternalism, couching women's pain solely in relation to their male relatives and symbolically entrenching the generative capabilities of the mother for sustaining a particular national identity. We then turned to the third case, Furingia, which, unlike these civil suits, was a criminal case brought by the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, against Anto Furingia, who was the commander of the Jokers, a special unit of the Croatian Defense Council's military police. Their members kidnapped, tortured, and repeatedly raped a woman referred to during the trial as Witness A. and in contrast to the collective frames employed in previous cases, the crux of the prosecutorial strategy relied on one woman's experience, and the credibility of witness A's memory was relentlessly attacked by the defense due to her post-traumatic stress disorder arising from this incident. The decision, which did find Farangia guilty, ultimately affirmed the power of witness A's recollection and experience, which led me to put forth the frame of reliable victim prosecutrix. This frame is valuable within broader trends around the treatment of rape survivors seeking legal remedy. However, the case does put forth a limited definition of rape that might preclude victims from recognizing themselves as such. Going forward, we see that the legal response to rape during the Bosnian War marked a watershed moment for gender's formal recognition in international law. I argue the necessity of this continued inclusion in security, peace-building, nation-building, and judicial discourses. When crafting litigation that takes on gendered crimes, as with other memorialization processes, we must think carefully about how and which legal frames are employed, recognizing their potential strengths and ramifications, and exploring how they might open novel pathways. We must continue to probe the meaning of justice, what that looks like, while moving beyond an over-reliance on punitive and carceral solutions. Instead, we might look to civil society-led initiatives like the Sarajevo Women's Court that provide the opportunity for women to tell their stories in their own voices, while seeking to build a more peaceful and equitable society in the wake of extreme conflict. Unfortunately, the kind of violence experienced during the Bosnian War is not unique, and since the war's formal culmination in 1995, it seems that never again has happened again and again and again. How we tell our history directly shapes our future. So my hope with this thesis is that it helps us tell a more complete story of conflict and highlights the tools available to us in the pursuit of justice. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Spencer, and this is Legislating Language, the effects of multi-level governance on regional identity and national unity. I argue that to understand conflict as societies become more diverse, we need to pay attention to policies that affect who we believe ourselves to be and how we form community. Thank you all for being here, and especially to Professors Elliott and Baquero for their guidance, perspective, and intellectual support throughout this journey. There are 281 million international migrants. That is 1 in 30 people. In just the last decade, this number has gone up 27%. The result? Demographics in all nations are evolving, and multiculturalism is everywhere. Today, challenges brought about by globalization and migration bring issues of unity and diversity to the forefront of world politics. Governments use language policy as a tool to unify diverse societies. Language shapes politics, creates social realities, and is fundamental to the functioning of democracy. I spent last spring and this January living in Barcelona, a city with an enormous amount of legislation on language. I was fascinated by the regional government's extensive promotion of Catalan. Here we're looking at La Queta. She's a protagonist of a number of Catalonia's language campaigns, and this version, the new 2023 version, has a number of different phenotypes and accents to represent the diversity of the Catalan people. La Queta is all over Catalonia. In many instances, she tells us to use Catalan instead of Castilian Spanish, despite Spain's laws protecting the national language. As I witnessed explosive and polarized reactions to La Queta and the policies she represents, I wondered about the relationship between co-located policies and co-located identities. This curiosity led me to ask the research question, to what extent does language policy across 3 levels of governance influence identity and national unity? And to answer this question, I first ask, under what conditions do tensions across the European Union, Spain, and Catalonia's language policies affect regional identity and national unity? There are 2 bodies of literature relevant to my study. First, the relationship between language policy, identity, and unity, and second, tensions across 3 levels of governance. Governments use language to generate national identity. States construct and promote one coherent identity to tell us who we are and to strengthen national unity, which ensures that states remain stable and will have long futures. However, identity is a moving target. Political, economic, familial, and otherwise personal factors affect identity. And culture shared across a territory, which I call geocultural identity, is always layered. A resident of Barcelona can at the same time feel Catalan, Spanish, and European, or not. Existing literature on identity and unity does not give due consideration to identity construction across multiple layers of policy. My study fills this gap by analyzing language policies across 3 levels of governance. I argue that contradictory language policies across supranational, national, and regional levels affect identity and national unity. The diagram illustrates a feedback loop. Language policies affect identity, identity affects unity, and the need for national unity then motivates language policies. I demonstrate that the need to preserve community across 3 levels causes language policies to conflict. That's the red lightning bolts. And that this tension then influences identity and unity. And each level of policy advances that own particular government's goals for unity. How did I go about this research? I use a 3-step approach to establish this argument. First, I plot a timeline of language policies from 3 levels of governance in 3 distinct periods from 1978 to 2023. Within each period, I created an exhaustive list of policies, and I carried out a textual analysis on laws that in any way legislate on language. Next, I investigate Catalonia's use of language campaigns, associated imagery, and education policies as a nexus of implementation measures. Language campaigns do more than just encourage language use. They construct and promote identity. My analysis pays special attention to interventions in the linguistic landscape of the territory. Lastly, I conducted key informant interviews and charted quarterly public opinion surveys from the past 40 years. I used this data to evaluate the extent to which formal legal contradictions generate tensions in identity and unity. I find that when Catalonia emphasizes strong links between language and identity, there is relative unity. Conversely, when the regional government stops language policy and identity construction, Catalonia's population experiences dramatic shifts in geocultural identity that fuel political crises and deteriorate national unity. From 1978 to 1996, in the first period, language policy implementation defends Catalan regional identity in response to prior autocratic restrictions. The effect is consistent geocultural identity and strong national unity. From 1997 to 2010, in the second period, Catalonia reframes regional language use as a necessary condition of identity and social participation. The result is again consistent patterns of geocultural identity and strong regional unity. The third period's findings are most surprising. In 2010, Spain's constitutional court reduced Catalan legislative autonomy on language. From 2011 to 2020, the regional government limited language policy. It demoted Catalan status from a signal of identity to a mere language of resource. And just at the moment when Spain's restrictive policies disrupt Catalonia's identity construction projects, identity polarizes and unity weakens. My finding is this: tensions across levels of governance weaken national unity. So what do we do with this? I draw 5 implications for theory and methods. First, current explanations of national unity and the forces that influence it must adopt a tripartite approach to comparative politics. Second, national unity is both a cause and effect of language policy. The need for unity motivates different levels of language policy that then influence identity and unity. Language policy is both proactive and reactive. This is the feedback loop. But how do we know what level to pay attention to? History determines the relative impact of regions. Without the systemic oppression of regional language and identity under the prior autocratic regime, there may have been no initial impulse to defend and define the regional identity. The relative importance of each level of governance varies as a result of historical events. So what does history tell us about the levels? The findings of my thesis support a turn towards localization of policy. Despite growing supranational arrangements globally, regional and otherwise local level policies have a greater impact on identity and unity at certain times. Lastly, future studies on the effects of language policy on identity and unity should examine public campaigns, imagery, and landscape as a nexus of government socialization tools. And why is this all important? So long as the Tower of Babel stands, languages will always exist in opposition. So too will identities. Understanding the processes that perpetuate tension and conflict will only become more important as migration, autonomy movements, and supranational and subnational arrangements continue to grow. If we care about the peaceful coexistence of many cultural groups, we must tune into the tensions and government mechanisms that affect who we are. To defend or promote one geocultural identity is to decide the fate of multiculturalism. Thank you.
Well, these were extraordinarily rich presentations. I think there is a lot to discuss. I'm hoping you have questions for the three presenters. So I'd like to, with that, open the floor to questions. Yes, Professor Best.
I have a question for Eva about your interview subjects. I have a question for Eva about your interview subjects. So I would love to hear a little more about what you asked them, what you learned from them, and in what ways did they narrate their experience with religion, with German, and with German policies, and just hear a little more color.
Oh. Thank you so much for the question. Is this working? Okay. So I developed, with the help of my advisors, I developed a questionnaire that I used as a guide but didn't necessarily stick to rigidly. And I was hoping to frame the interviews as conversations about their experiences living in Germany as the descendants of Turkish immigrants. I had several sections that I wanted to address in my interviews. A lot of them had to do with their own personal experiences in education or in the workplace, depending on their ages, or both. And then I also had experiences with religion, as well as their own views on politics, because I wanted to see how they perceive the political events that are relevant to their identities as well in Germany. So I asked them about some of the things I had read about in my content when I was collecting sources for my content analysis, seeing how they would interpret or react to them. So, for example, I asked them about a debate that has been prevalent in Germany about a leading or guiding culture that has recently been reawakened by the Interior Minister in 2017. And I read them a quote about the Interior Minister describing Germany as a Christian nation that is defined by churches and Christian holidays. And I asked them, the majority of my interview subjects were Muslim, and I asked them how they reacted to that quote. And I got some very varied responses to a lot of the questions that I expected similar responses to. So that was also surprising. it was a variety of responses. So there are some people who agreed with the quote, some people who disagreed, and in the same way, with many of the other questions, I found that even the small selection of interview subjects I had a huge variation between them, and that was a very interesting and surprising finding of my interviews, especially in conjunction with the content analysis, because I found that it's difficult to make general claims about immigrant populations, even with such a small sample.
Hi, yeah, I've got a question for you, Alex. I guess I'm just wondering, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about the ethnography that you did last year, last spring, and just sort of who you spoke to, how willing they were to speak with you, and how that kind of shaped the research that you then carried out this year as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that question. I appreciate having the opportunity to speak a little bit more about this. Being in the place where this history occurred truly opened my eyes to facets that I could not have otherwise gotten from textbooks, even from these legal cases, even from remote interviews. Oop. A dramatic flourish. So, to give an example, when walking down the streets of Sarajevo, I looked on the ground and I thought I had stepped in a puddle. And instead, what was a big red splatter, I later learned, was actually a historical artifact. They call them the Sarajevo Roses, and it is a memorialization of wherever more than 3 people were killed in a particular area. So whether it's the government or citizens, both participate and repeatedly every few years come in and pour resin into the street to make sure that people don't forget what happened. So thinking about how this war continues to shape the daily experiences of people in Bosnia was very impactful. When I had the opportunity to visit the site where Srebrenica, where the genocide occurred, I was lucky enough to speak to a survivor of the war. He now is the curator of the museum there, so meets every day with people from around the world and is tasked with telling his own story of personal loss. His father, his brother were killed. And I was able to follow up with him and actually meet with him while writing this and have a regular relationship where I was able to continue to sort of pick his brain to make sure I was telling this story right, because it's such an important story to tell. And I think just the qualitative richness that being there, experiencing this imbued in the thesis was invaluable. And it definitely was sort of a light bulb moment when I was able to realize that this was all valuable data, that this was a more complete story when I was able to incorporate those particular experiences into the broader argument I was building.
I know Spencer's going to get a lot of questions, so I have a follow-on for Alex. If you're willing to share this, because your topic is so important yet so traumatic. For future scholars, how did you take care of yourself through this process and keep so driven to produce this amazing product?
Yeah, that's a really beautiful question, and it's something I think a lot about. Actually, for the past 8 years, I've been studying genocide and post-conflict reconciliation, and to do so, I've traveled to a variety of post-conflict contexts, including Rwanda, Guatemala, Hungary, and Indonesia, and then now Bosnia. And I really try to first not lose sight of sort of the tangible emotional impact that these histories have had, and I think due to the generosity of the people with whom I speak, that is really brought to life. But in terms of sort of the scholarly inquiry, it is emotionally taxing. So I think, I don't know if I figured it out necessarily, but I'd say knowing that I'm in community with others, with scholars, with activists, with historians who are working every day to ensure that these stories are not lost, that they are told in equitable and sustainable ways. So that brings me sort of great joy in doing this work.
Hi. My question is for Spencer. You touched briefly on how a lot of the language policies that emerged in Spain in kind of the 90s and the 2000s were kind of downstream of what the policies were during the Franco dictatorship, which was super interesting. So could you speak a little bit more about how minority languages were treated during the dictatorship?
Yes, definitely. Thank you for your question. So this particular dictatorship was a long one. it started in 1939 and went until 1975 when Franco died. And the imposition of the policies varies throughout this long period, but the general rule was complete obstruction and restriction of all regional language and identity demonstration in public and private spheres. So, of course, that's in all environments that are subject to government control, like schools, public spaces. It was completely prohibited. And then also, there was a lot of socialization and intervention into the psyche of all of Spain, and like a lot of use of like the sort of similar interventions that I researched in culture that like he would use. He has like specific mottos that like connect the use of language to like the identity of being Spanish and to the territory and to the might and image of this this one Catholic Spain. And there's also, so like that's sort of the identity piece to it, and then the fear factor. There are stories of people being like brutally attacked, obviously emotionally, but also physically for using their language in public. And so I think there's the next, as you said, the next period right after the dictatorship is sort of inspired by a need to first reclaim that identity and also show that it can and should be used everywhere, in all public and private spheres.
Hi, thank you all for your great presentations. A follow-up for you, Spencer. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the role of the media. You showed that great image on your first slide, so I'm just wondering about that.
Yeah. Do you mean like, actually I guess I can answer both. So the media that I researched was all government sponsored media, and I guess media is a really big term, but the intervention, so first there's like the government saying this is like the media in terms of like videos, like audio, like visual, cultural items that were promoted and sort of like proliferated around the territory, and that was that would be like YouTube videos. More recently, it could be like there were card games put in schools, board games. There's that, like the last image was a podcast booth that was like transported to different towns and cities around Catalonia, where people could make the biggest podcast ever done in Catalan, and everyone could contribute to it and be a part of it, and their voice would be part of the project. And what's interesting to me in terms of the media is that it's not just like these aren't isolated incidents of like over and over again. Here's like a series. It's really like there's a continual and continuous theme to them. Like that character was first introduced in 2005 in another campaign, and used sort of in the early 2000s, and then was reintroduced in the past year. And then if you're walking in the city, you can see like the eyes on her, on like above the denture, like teeth part, is like they use those eyes in other like posters and imagery around the city for cultural events and civic centers. So you sort of feel bombarded by this thing that's telling you this is what being Catalan is, this is what using the language is, and this is what it looks like. And that's sort of my analysis of the media. In terms of like all media, that's not just government, it's really, there's a lot on both sides and everywhere in between. And there's a lot, and they take it, both sort of use the government sponsored media as a launching point to take it way farther on both sides that I don't quite have time to talk about now, but can talk to you about after.
There are a couple of questions.
Hi, everyone. Great job. My question is for Alexandra. This idea of collective identity I find really fascinating, or the concept of it, and kind of like the tension that creates the collective identity at a national level, and how it sometimes might stand at odds with local truths and local memories. I'm specifically thinking like after George Floyd, and we saw the civil rights monuments being protested and changed in different communities along the South. In terms of the Bosnian context, now you have the quote that you started off by saying that it seems like the political sentiments, let's forget these bad or old times, but then you also have these sites of memory, like the resin pools that you're talking about. Can you talk about that dissonance, or how like the malleability of collective memory has changed over time in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that sort of the findings of this case are not limited to this region, and that unfortunately all over the world we have to have these moments of reckoning. And I think with the George Floyd moment, we saw sort of coming to terms with this history, or at least starting that process in a more substantive and engaged way, and thinking about, for example, how monuments played a role in that, these public affective connections to that history, how we have to confront it rather than erase it, even when it is one that is deeply problematic and traumatic, but then how we can use that to inform our policy, sort of our communities going forward. So the messiness of collective memory, of sort of the politics of memory, I think are so central to this project, and again to this broader national conversation that we find ourselves in today, which is to say it's not easy, it is ongoing, it should be ongoing, but willingness to sort of sit in that discomfort, to embrace sort of the complexity of the project, and do so with attention to equity and justice is of the utmost importance.
Go ahead, Tom.
Okay, the same question to all of you. Eva started to answer it, but I'm curious, like, in your research, what was the most surprising thing that you found? What was the thing that you came across that you really hit you out of left field and made you think about this in a different way?
I can start. I did allude to this earlier. I did have a very surprising finding in terms of the generalization that a lot of Turkish immigrants experience in Germany, both on an ethnic and on a religious level. And this is one place where I found some difference between the results of my content analysis and the results of my interviews. In my content analysis, a surprising finding that I had was that on the level of religion and the role of Islam in Europe and Muslims, Turkish immigrants in Germany, these kinds of issues are discussed in more pan-European context, but social and political issues like family or politics are discussed in a more specific Turkish immigrants in Germany context. But then in the interviews, I found that Turkish immigrants and the descendants of Turkish immigrants in Germany do still feel like there is a generalization of their religion, so they are grouped with other Muslims, but at the same time they are also grouped with other ethnic groups of the same racial origin. So one of my interview subjects, for example, stated that it doesn't matter if you're Moroccan, you're still a Turk. And in the German context, that was a very surprising finding, especially then comparing that to the results of my content analysis. I found that not only is this generalization very important in terms of religion, but also in terms of race.
I think there were three sort of the most surprising findings I had during this process were, first, just the complexity of the conflict. Following the dissolution of Yugoslavia, we see the emergence of these new states, of proto-states, in which ethnic, religious, and sort of quasi-national identities are all merged in very complicated ways. And over the course of the war, from 92 to 95, we see shifting alliances, a huge emergence of paramilitaries. So it becomes very difficult to ascribe blame and responsibility. This is something that informed a lot of the legal processes in the following decades. So I think that piece of it, and I also found that a fascinating piece of this puzzle. Second, just thinking about the historical recency, 30 years sounds long, that's one generation. So that means everybody over the age of 30 who's currently living in Bosnia and has done so since the 90s has a war story, or if not, their children were raised sort of in the shadow of this experience. So thinking about that when I was conducting interviews, when I was immersing in that ethnographic work. And third, just how incomplete justice was. I think I was initially introduced to this very triumphant framing of the ICTY in conjunction with the ICTR, which was the Rwandan equivalent of this ad hoc criminal tribunal, where we saw sort of novel forums for justice, new crimes, particularly in regard to rape as a crime of war, as a crime of genocide, ethnic cleansing, really important precedent set. So it was sort of this triumphant look back. But in actuality, first we saw that it was a very sort of subjective narrative that didn't fully encompass, the richness of a full experience, but also that there were so many people for whom justice never reached and who are living now side by side with people who may have killed their families, again, just 30 years ago. So thinking about what can we do to make this better, to make it a more inclusive justice system is something that I am continuing to grapple with.
Thank you for your question. I was most surprised by the trends that I found when I plotted identity and special unity. And I think I had this expectation and maybe fear that from conversations and experiences there, that this topic is so thorny, is the word that's been used, and that everyone feels, you could ask 100 people in the same room and everyone would tell you a different thing and feel a different way about it. And when I took the data on identity and unity and plotted it, the trends were so delineated and clear. And then my next surprise was to see that the trends didn't line up with events in a way that I expected them to, that they weren't a reaction to elections or political events, cultural events, things that happened throughout, 40 years is a long time, that the years lined up so exactly really with shifts in policy. And that was really exciting to see.
There's a question.
Just a true finger there. Just on the last twist, the one that's surprising
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that from sort of diversity producing unity,
Yeah.
diversity producing disunity, what's the policy shift that you saw there
Yeah.
that triggered it?
So in 2006, Catalonia had revised their Statute of Autonomy, which has first been written in 1979, 1 year after, or published then, right after the Spanish Constitution and their transition to democracy. And the revamping of the autonomy statute in 2006, they assumed a lot of liberties on legislation, particularly identity and language, and re-termed a lot of the, they had called it Catalonia a nationality, and that was even debated, and then it became a nation. And that was a lot of debates launched right after that. And in 2010 is when Spain's Constitutional Court issued a ruling basically redacting a lot of the 2006 statute, that update, and just completely weakening the regional government's ability to legislate and to match their language goals to their goals for identity and nationhood.
Okay. I think we have time for a few more questions.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Mhm.
My question's for Spencer. I'm curious to know your thoughts on the rule of law and democracy in this argument, because I know you studied in Spain where it's a really important element of crafting a regional identity, and how, if you saw any other examples where that's made much more difficult because of a lack of democracy or rule of law?
Yeah, so great question, thank you. Rule of law is a funny term. I think the one thing that in my research design sort of accounts for is that the law and the implementation of it are two different things. And that the law can say one thing, the law can say here, this sign in this place has to be in this language and not that one. It has to be in both languages, in one place but not the other. And that's just like, when you go there, that's not what you're seeing. So even in democracies, even in strong democracies, the law is different from its implementation and also how non-government entities follow it. So that's my first comment. The next comment is that my case is representative of other democracies in the sense that there are many other arrangements, subnational, national, supranational arrangements, where in democratic countries, take like Quebec, Canada, different parts of the United Kingdom, Belgium, Switzerland, where there are regional areas that have distinct identities from other regions and from the nation. And then I think so that's for democracy. And then I think autocracy and other forms of government I think the relationship would be even stronger there. And I haven't studied it, but in contexts where governments can have a way more freedom or ability to impose an identity and an ideology in dictatorships, that the relationship would be much stronger because the reaction doesn't matter, and that they can put everywhere all over a city. Recent trip to Cuba, everywhere you went, there was a sign telling you about the revolution, and they invent the way that Catalonia may invent a certain ideology and try to impose it, and an autocracy can do that much more strongly.
Thank you.
So we'll take these will be the last two quick questions so that we can move on to the next panel. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for your presentation. My question is for Alex. Rape, when used as a weapon of war, conflates violence against women at the domestic and national level. And I would love to hear your thoughts, how in the context of your research would you relate violence against women at different levels with peace?
Mm-hmm. So could I just ask a clarifying question? You're saying specifically looking at rape during context of war, or also more broadly in just domestic sort of settings?
Rape in the context of war takes a crime that can be so domestic and intimate to a level that becomes national. It's a crime against all women when you use it as a weapon of war. So how would you relate these different levels of violence against women with a possibility for peace in a post-war context?
Definitely. I think that's a great question, and this public-private dichotomy is really pervasive throughout a lot of literature currently existing on rape law, and that is sort of blown up to a very extreme degree when we see it within these contexts of war, and specifically ethnic cleansing and genocide, where what is understood as sort of a deeply intimate, invasive, and private crime that, again, to this day is highly stigmatized, there's much taboo surrounding it, takes on a significance sort of that is greater and more strategic. So this was really the first time in international law when the linkage between perpetrating rape and a nation-building process, sort of when that was connected. Previously, there's this narrative that sexual violence during war is just this unfortunate corollary, but it doesn't have that strategic intent. And it was made very clear during this conflict that that was not the case, that the way that rape, that reproductive coercion was enacted was done so through this sort of patrilineal ideology of creating more Serb babies, of affecting sort of reproductive continuity of the Bosniak group. And again, to this day, the stigma is so extreme that many survivors of this sexual violence have not told their partners, their children, many of whom are the direct product of this rape. So that's been a significant piece in terms of grappling with the legacy of the war today.
So I think to that extent, this case has tremendous utility for how we, again, can reconceptualize sort of the public ramifications of this private crime. But what we see through these gender frames is that there are, again, are very intentional elements into how categories of victimhood are constructed and what are the respective strengths of, say, framing it as gendered solidarity, as women as a class, tapping into these sort of transnational feminist sentiments, which we did see successfully employed. But then with my last case, where it's just this one woman story up against this broad military apparatus, where they are questioning the validity of her story, of her memory, and ultimately it says this one experience, this one story, regardless of whether it happened to a certain number of people, is important, is worthy of intervention, of retribution, of justice. So I think we can see sort of the full spectrum of sort of what that sort of individual to collective sort of relationship to this crime looks like, but also recognizing that this is a really pivotal moment in shaping how we think about sort of both in legal discourse as well in public policy and cultural discourse about these sort of greater implications of this particular crime.
We are over time, so Annie has a question she wants to ask Eva. Is it quick? Can we do it quickly?
Yeah.
Okay. And Eva?
Eva, my question is to you. What policy recommendations do you have given your findings, particularly related to religiosity and isolation?
I think, as I mentioned, I alluded to in my presentation, most of the policies are in the realm of integration policy, but specifically in education in the workplace and in instituting religion in a way that is more inclusive beyond just Christianity. And I mean, to give some examples, in schools and in the majority of state schools in Germany, the holidays or the days that people have off are Christian holidays, and that depends by state, but there are I don't know if there are any states where non-Christian holidays are recognized and where there are school holidays, and it is similar in the workplace as well. So one big recommendation I would have, and is an example of more inclusive religious and policies in education and the workplace, would be allowing or instituting days off for people, making it more general rather than placing the responsibility for people of different religions to ask for those days off and use their days off for their own religious holidays, when Christians can take that for granted. But then there are a lot of other policies too that, for example, integration policies that go beyond religion. So like I mentioned in my presentation, there are other important aspects of integration policy like language and like citizenship that are also very important and do need to be addressed, although that is beyond the scope of what I specifically studied. There are many different pillars of integration policy that do need to be addressed to be more inclusive.
Thank you, Eva. My apologies for going over by a few minutes. There's so much to discuss with these projects, but let's give this wonderful panel an awesome hand.
And we are turning up the air conditioning. have a few more.
There we go. Here. One more. Jordan, do you mind shutting that door right now since there's a celebration out there? And we appreciate it's warm in here as well.
We're working on the AC.
So
It
thank
should
you
be
for.
going up. We hope.
All right. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for staying. It's a pretty glorious day on College Hill out there. And so it shows the commitment for those who are in the room to celebrate our scholars that are sitting up here with me. My name is Dave Pilati. I'm super fortunate to be a senior fellow here. And I will be brief so that we can get right to this important discussion. But I'll say that I had no idea when I agreed to start teaching courses here how incredibly rewarding it would be to get to serve as an honors thesis advisor or secondary reader, or just a supporter of students that you know that are doing an honors thesis, and what a special experience that is for a faculty. So highlighting that, it's probably been mentioned previously, but that's a really important part. And I want to extend a warm welcome to those who are online, who don't have the benefit of being here, but really thank those who are in the room to support our students up here in the front. Today's discussion, this last panel of these really important 2 days, is understanding international intervention in a complex global world. And there are probably not enough angry, chaotic adjectives that we could insert into that title, and the topics that could be covered. But these three picked certainly three very important ones, serious ones for us to explore. So these impressive scholars that sit in front of me, I get to teach. I'm really fortunate, but I also am a practitioner, and I had 30 years working in the national and human security fields. So as I reviewed their honors theses over the past few days, I was blown away not just by the rigor of the research and a real appreciation and respect for the process that they've undertaken, not just for the past year, but I suspect second semester of junior year and much of your summer was devoted to thinking about this prior to senior year. It's a long time to work on this process. And I was really enthralled with the findings from a practitioner perspective and not just an academic one. So I wanted to highlight that, and that's pretty much the same perspective that I think every advisor and faculty has for all of the 18 honors theses that were submitted this year. The global, national, and regional significance of these issues we're going to talk about today in this increasingly chaotic world is really important. So sit back and enjoy the ride here in a second. And I think my favorite part of this process is watching how these students bring order to chaos. And that's regardless of the topic that they choose. And so for the next hour or so, we're going to dive in. Please be educated. This is going to be thought-provoking. It's going to be stimulating. And I think it's going to help shape new perspectives for you on the topics that they decided to cover. I'm going to quickly introduce the three of them, and I'm going to tell you the title of their theses, even though you're going to see it. But I want you in your mind to be able to categorize what's coming. And then, depending on how we do on time, I might start out with a question that I have for each of them, but based on the questions that have been coming in from the room, I may pause and hold off that one and let the audience jump in first and save that one for the end to make sure we have time. And so first up is going to be Elliot Trendle, who explores private contractor violence in conflict, conditional state decision-making under an accountability dilemma. We'll then hear from Aicha Olgan, who examines digital foreign interventions, combating computational propaganda through effective media innovation. And then last will be Sophia Yee Wadsworth, who tackles When the Complacent Giant Stirs, hegemonic behavior during instability in the global world order. And with no further ado, Elliot, the podium is yours.
Good afternoon. My name is Elliot Trendle, and today I'm presenting my thesis, Private Contractor Violence in Conflict. conditional state decision-making under an accountability dilemma. I'd like to start off by thanking my two advisors, Professor Pilati and then Professor Pauly in the back. Without your support, both of your support throughout this entire process, this would not have been possible. And I'd also like to extend a special thanks to my honors thesis seminar professor, Claudia Elliott. Thank you for all of your support throughout everything. Since the end of the Cold War, many states have outsourced core security capabilities to private military and security companies, or PMSCs. Although PMSCs resemble other armed groups like mercenary groups, they're different. Unlike mercenary groups, PMSCs are legally incorporated business entities which provide a range of military and security services to a range of consumers. Sometimes these services require arms, and through contracts, states or national governments empower contractors to use coercive force on their behalf. Now, governments often hire contractors to offset some of the costs in their national security apparatuses. And PMSCs have become integral to many states' foreign policy implementation, especially in the wake of the global war on terror. However, states using PMSCs also surrender an amount of control over their use of armed force in conflict. When PMSC contractors commit violence against non-combatants in conflict, they create an accountability dilemma for states. Well, we would think that governments would want to hold contractors accountable for misconduct in conflict. Yet over the past 3 decades, there has been striking inconsistency in their accountability around the world in multiple different conflicts. So this leads me to my research question. What conditions shape state decisions to hold PMSC contractors accountable for violent misconduct? So there is a wealth of research out there currently about the multidimensional challenges states face under the accountability dilemma, especially regarding the legal, economic, and normative sides of regulating and managing PMSCs. However, current scholarship largely focuses on PMSCs and deprivileges and decenters states and national governments. They don't consider how the accountability dilemma affects state decision-making. I hypothesize that a state's domestic conditions and international conditions interact to influence state decision-making in PMSC accountability processes. And variations in these conditions create inconsistency in PMSC accountability. And to explain how these conditions interact, I developed the conditional accountability framework, which synthesizes constructivist theories of norms and identity and social structure in politics with theories of bureaucratic political decision-making, which examines how actors in national government bureaucracies interact with each other to arrive at decisions. It theorizes that domestic and international conditions interact with each other. Domestic and international norms interact with each other and influence bureaucratic actors' preferences for PMSC accountability. And those divergent preferences clash to create inconsistency in PMSC accountability processes. So inconsistent PMSC accountability has practical consequences. PMSC reliance can undermine state control over coercive force, and PMSC's interests do not always align with states' interests. PMSC contractors that operate with impunity can also increase the costs of conflict. They can undermine military forces' flexibility and increase risk of harm against civilians. I conducted a single case study of the United States government during the global war on terror for this thesis. From 2001 to 2021, I developed and tested my conditional accountability framework. This case has high within-case variation and intrinsic importance, as the US government is the largest state consumer of private force services. Multiple federal agencies within the United States government use PMSCs for different reasons. And despite many documented instances of PMSC misconduct throughout the global war on terror, there is a striking lack of accountability for those individuals. Within the US case, I examined 3 incidents of violent contractor misconduct with different accountability outcomes. The first involved a CIA contract interrogator named David Pissarro, who killed an Afghan detainee and was held legally accountable. The second was detainee abuse at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, which involved DoD contractors and contract interrogators and military personnel working together and did not result in contractor accountability. The third was the Nicer Square massacre, where a group of State Department contractors from the PMSC Blackwater killed nearly 20 unarmed civilians and were convicted and then pardoned in 2020. So for my methodology, I first traced the US government's response to each incident using process tracing, which allowed me to uncover the conditions influencing each accountability process. I then compared them using congruence procedure type 2 analysis, which allowed me to examine the relative influence of these conditions across all three accountability processes. For my evidence, I primarily relied upon US government documents and data, including documents from the Congressional Research Service, congressional transcript testimony, and publicly available internal documents from the CIA, DoD, and other federal agencies. And I also used a small amount of international archival data as well to supplement the domestic documents that I analyzed. So findings. First, I found that the US government largely holds a preference for individual contractor accountability rather than systemic accountability. Government personnel involvement in misconduct made accountability for contractors less likely, and government decision makers appeared more concerned with holding each other accountable than holding contractors accountable. Second, federal agencies were the chief decision makers for PMSC accountability and all contractor accountability processes. These organizations each held divergent organizational practices and preferences regarding contractor use and accountability, which contributed to inconsistency between these three processes. Third, breakdowns of control over contractors at the federal agency level presented significant obstacles to PMSC accountability. Accountability processes focused on holding government actors accountable for losing control over their contractor agents. Fourth, domestic and international norms did influence accountability decision-making, but only insofar as they had been internalized within the organizational culture of a given agency. Norms influence PMSC accountability decision-making to the greatest extent when other organizational actors in the US government place normative pressure on federal agency decision-makers. For the implications of these findings. First, for the United States government and US policymaking broadly. Requiring individual federal agencies to oversee, manage, and regulate their own contractors undermines their coordination in conflict. A US government-wide system of armed contractor management would prevent poor contractor oversight in one agency from undermining US interests broadly. Second, government decision-makers must delegate the authority to use force within stricter constraints. Contractors can easily insubordinate the authority of federal agencies if their use of violence is not controlled. Third, patterns of PMSC impunity threaten the credibility of the US government's normative commitments in conflict. Holding contractors individually accountable is necessary, but it is not sufficient for protecting the US government's normative credibility on the international stage. PMSCs themselves must also be meaningfully held accountable. For scholarship's understandings of PMSCs in conflict, these findings also have three implications. First, PMSCs limit options in government decision-making. They constrain governments by increasing intergovernmental tension between different actors in the bureaucracy and create accountability costs for which government decision-makers must account. Second, norms do matter in PMSC accountability decision-making, but their influence varies between government organizations. Different organizational actors can be responsive to different norms, further straining the government's decision-making in conflict. Third, current scholarship's conceptualization of PMSCs and the state monopoly on force requires more nuance. PMSCs do not usurp the state monopoly on force themselves. Conflict over controlling the means of coercive force within the state occurs between government organizations prior to PMSCs being introduced. PMSCs simply add more tension into that already complex, interdependent, interconnected structure. Overall, PMSC misconduct and conflict reveals an imperative for state organizations to coordinate their decision-making for accountability. As private actors become more active in international affairs, states like the United States must remove internal barriers to PMSC accountability. Otherwise, international security could go from being a public good to a private commodity. Thank you. Since I forgot my number there.
Hello, and thank you for being here. Before I start, I want to also thank...
Sorry, I'm gonna be in slide mode.
Thank you.
There you go.
I also want to thank my primary advisor, Professor Don Brancati, and my secondary advisor, Professor Regina Longo. This thesis wouldn't have been possible without their ongoing support and incredible expertise. My thesis is Digital Foreign Interventions, Combating Computation Propaganda Through Effective Media Innovation. In this thesis, I asked the question, how do foreign digital interventions affect the US public opinion? And what steps can we take to diminish and minimize the effect these interventions have on our public opinion? Here you can see a quote from an interview I had with a Meta executive recently, citing that this topic overall has been a very hot topic, not only in the public sector, but as we can see in the private sector also. So let's start from the very beginning. What is propaganda? Propaganda has many definitions. Edward Bernays, father of public relations, essentially said that propaganda is a necessary component of democracies, that it doesn't necessarily have to include misinformation. However, for the purposes of my thesis, I acknowledge the definition of propaganda accepted by the NATO doctrine. Information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote a political cause or point of view. So what then is computational propaganda? Computational propaganda, while is an incredibly new term, is incredibly relevant to our daily life. The use of algorithms, automation, and human curation to distribute misleading information over social media networks purposefully. One way to do this is by using bots on social media. So this practice, using computational propaganda to change public opinion, is incredibly common. Bots account for from 25 to 68% of Twitter users, depending on the time and issues being discussed, with the content they produce times and times over this number, as suggested by other previous research. So we also unfortunately know and have been recently acknowledging the fact that the practice is incredibly effective. During research during the 2016 elections measured that for every 25,000 tweets produced by the Russian Internet Agency, Russia's propaganda agency, a 1% increase in election opinion polls was detected. Considering the 25,000 this agency can continue producing, the danger this produces is apparent. So what has been done to combat this so far? The US government has mostly burdened this threats on private companies. While they're expecting private companies to deal with this threat, they have, for a short period of time, for 3 weeks, built a disinformation task force, which was ironically stopped due to widespread right-wing reaction on Twitter, now X. So while trying to intervene into this new threat, an overarching concern for US policymakers is concerns regarding interfering into the private sphere. One, it is widely debated that these interventions can actually impact the international competitiveness of these firms as they interfere into the profit models, considering how much Twitter, Meta, how much these organizations depend on the use of bots for their ad monetization systems. So what have tech companies done so far? Tech companies have removed bots in response to specific user requests on an individual basis. They have also banned accounts, however, none official, none of any official significance. Rather, again, individual accounts. But most importantly, they have tried to implement a government-funded media tag, as can be viewed here in this example tweet. So when this tag was implemented, the question of what organizations this tag should be implemented of rather dominated the debate regarding the tag itself, rather than whether this tag actually works in helping people recognize the existence of propaganda in the content that they're being exposed to. So essentially, in order to not only measure the effectiveness of this tag, but also to find what measures we can take, what other interface models we can utilize to minimize the effects of the threat, I conducted an experiment. In November, when I was writing this thesis, there was no pre-existing experiments on this topic. However, Brandon Nyhan from Dartmouth University did publish a paper suggesting the ineffectiveness of the tag in particular. So how did I run this experiment? I exposed 1,000 participants via Prolific to 3 different pieces of propaganda content presented via 4 different interface models. 1, control, without any warnings. 2, the tag. And 2 of my own design. The first one is the alternative information interface. It proposes an alternative information about the subject that the primary tweet the user is being exposed to the user at the same time. The second one is the forewarning interface. In this interface, people need to interact with the interface and need to interact with the message that the interface is showing with them before being exposed to the content itself. So while conducting this experiment, I measured the impact of misinformation on these people's beliefs, but also the virality of the tweet by asking them if they would retweet it, like it, and the reactions they would give online to these content. I also tested many more heterogeneous treatment effects, such as the impact of country affinity, country knowledge, skepticism of social media, and digital media literacy. So, my results. My results were surprising to say the least. In terms of statistically significant findings, the t-statistics here can show you that the tag did not work in conveying misinformation to people. Actually, it did not, people did not cite any sort of change in the extent to which they believed propaganda when proposed with the tag. However, sadly, the alternative information did also not work. Yet there was one interface that managed to work. The forewarning interface did statistically succeed in minimizing the effects of computational propaganda. Yet one thing to be careful about here is that it succeeded when regressed with the tag, not when regressed with the control. Of course, this could have to do with my confidence interval, which was 95%, which is rather a high one for 1,000 people. However, it showed that the forewarning was particularly better than the tag. And why was this? I also asked participants what they understood the tag, the warning, on the interface to be. And a whopping 24% of participants actually believed that the tag meant the source was reliable instead of not reliable. This actually could change based on where you do the experiment is what I am suggesting. Because we do know that for people living in authoritarian regimes, content being produced by their government could sign to it being propaganda. However, in the US context, people actually associated it being funded by a government with being more reliable, better funded, better researched. And other statistically significant results I found were how much people's affinity towards a country impacts the extent to which they believe in the country's propaganda. Surprisingly, people's previous knowledge did not impact their belief in misinformation propaganda as much as I thought it would. But let's move on to policy implications. So far, states around the world, mainly EU, has focused on debunking interventions to combat this threat, especially with the Digital Services Act. They claim that in the case that we do an opposite campaign, proposing the exact opposite message of the propaganda, we can succeed. However, the fact that the alternative information interface did not work also suggests that with computational propaganda, there are certain complications that are different than traditional propaganda. While debunking interventions might be useful in the context of traditional propaganda, within the context of digital propaganda, this does not seem to be so. So this also answers the question, should the US cyber policy officials take the EU Digital Services Act as a blueprint? Considering the lack of research on what intervention is effective in debunking these misinformation propaganda, it is quite obvious that the US needs to go on its own way to produce more research, produce more individual, unique data, rather than just blueprinting the Digital Services Act. However, the most important finding, perhaps, of this research is the fact that it is not necessary to intervene into these companies' policy models or profit models to diminish the effects of computational propaganda. This thesis theoretically proves to us that we can, simply by changing the media architectures that the content is presented via, we can actually change the extent to which this propaganda is effective. Furthermore, considering how easy this interface, the forewarning interface, will be to implement, as my interviewee said, it will take an hour for Meta to implement this. This research also provides a solid step to take for big tech companies. Yeah, thank you for listening.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. I would, of course, like to first thank my wonderful advising team of Professor Lyle Goldstein, Professor Reid Pauley, and Professor Claudia Elliott for all their help during this process. At the end of the Cold War, many scholars heralded this as the ultimate victory of liberal democracy and the beginning of a stable world order. However, the last 2 decades have done a lot to disprove this prediction. Currently, Iran is pursuing nuclear capabilities, Russia is invading Ukraine, and China is openly harassing Philippine ships in the South China Sea. All of these are signs that the United States' hegemony and the liberal world order are in decline. American hegemony, of course, refers to the United States' position as the most powerful economic and military state in the world. And the liberal world order is the norms and institutions the United States supports through that preponderant position. Currently, many scholars agree that the greatest threat to American hegemony and the liberal world order is the People's Republic of China, whose incredible military modernization and economic advancement over the last 2 decades has allowed it to begin to pursue policies that directly challenge the liberal world order. Existing scholarship predicts that the United States can respond to this in 3 ways. First, it can reallocate resources to maintain its position as hegemon. 2, it could launch a preemptive war against China to eliminate this threat to its hegemony. Or 3rd, it could surrender its position as hegemon and become one of many great powers. However, that's not what we see. The United States has actually been largely complacent in its treatment of China and has largely tried to use existing systems within the international order to subsume China into the liberal world order. Only recently has China's threat stirred the United States into action and has begun contesting China in areas that were previously peripheral to its interests. This gap between predictions and observable policy led me to ask 2 important questions to understand the changes we see in the international system and US policy. How did the United States change its policy in peripheral areas towards China from 2000 to September 2023? And then to what extent does hegemonic behavior in peripheral areas change during times of instability in the global world order? There are 3 bodies of literature that claim to answer this question, but all of them have significant faults. First, foundational IR is so broad that it neglects important factors when examining hegemonic behavior. Meanwhile, theories of hegemony are ironically quite limited in their predictions of what the hegemon will actually do when contesting a rising power short of that preemptive war. Finally, I add a new framework, brinksmanship, to analyze hegemonic behavior in the periphery. However, brinksmanship is heavily founded in the Cold War. Therefore, all these theories need to be tested and then combined into a new critical framework for understanding hegemonic behavior in the periphery during times of instability in the global world order. So I sought to answer these questions by conducting a case study. I examined US policy in the South China Sea from 2000 to September 2023. I chose this case because the South China Sea contains key US interests, and changes in the United States' policy towards China during this time period aligned temporally with broader changes in US attitudes, behavior, and policy towards China in the international system. I then conducted a 4-step research project. First, I examined quantitative markers of US behavior in the South China Sea. Second, I examined 7 key policy documents towards China. This quantitative and qualitative analysis allowed me to see how the United States began its policy in the South China Sea, and then how that policy changed over time as China began challenging the liberal world order. Next, I examined theories I explained in my literature review to see if any of them could explain hegemonic behavior. I did this by using hegemonic order theory, offensive realism, structural liberalism, and brinksmanship to generate counterfactual predictions for US policy in the South China Sea. I then compared these predictions to what we actually observe in US policy as shown by my empirical data. This allowed me to determine that 3 of the theories can be combined into a new framework for examining hegemonic behavior in the periphery. So this also resulted in some interesting findings. First, the United States went from being a reactive actor in the South China Sea to a proactive actor. At the beginning, the United States mainly issued policy in response to Chinese behavior, but around 2019, the United States started attempting to preempt Chinese ambitions and goals in the region. Next, United States policy increasingly emphasized the importance of allies and attempted to internationalize the South China Sea disputes. Finally, the United States' position towards the South China Sea actually changed as China grew more powerful. The United States started as viewing the South China Sea as a peripheral issue, but as China increasingly challenged the liberal world order in the region, the United States treated the South China Sea as increasingly vital. Then in terms of theory, my testing shows that the United States went from pursuing a policy best explained by liberalism to one best examined through hegemonic order theory. Then, hegemonic order theory was also proven to have very strong explanatory power for US policy in the South China Sea. This shows that hegemonic order theory can be used not only to examine the stability of the overall world order, but also examine suborders within that larger framework. Finally, this theory testing highlighted the importance of examining foreign policy over a long time frame to best capture all the trends in larger international relations influencing a region's foreign policy, but also all the intra-regional factors affecting a state's foreign policy. Finally, this study has important implications for empirical research, theory, and policy. First, my research shows that foreign policy must be examined using multiple theories from a historical perspective. Then in terms of theory, I present a new useful framework for examining hegemonic behavior in the periphery during times of instability in the global order. This framework calls for hegemonic behavior to be examined through a sequence of theories over a long period of time to best understand whether the international order is stable and all the factors influencing change. Scholars should first use structural liberalism, then hegemonic order theory, and finally brinksmanship to analyze hegemonic behavior. Next, my thesis supports the hypothesis that nuclear weapons have a mitigating effect on interstate competition. Mutually assured destruction does indeed limit states' ability to compete in the international system, especially great powers. We can see this in how the United States and China have not engaged in kinetic conflict, but have instead been competing for relative strategic advantage, prestige, and allies in areas like the South China Sea. Finally, great power competition does in fact affect hegemonic perceptions and can make a region seem more vital if the hegemon perceives that region to be an arena of great power competition. Finally, I have 2 very important policy recommendations. First, if the world order is stable, as many argue it was during the 2000s and early 2010s, policymakers need to be careful to avoid hegemonic complacency. Hegemons are very reactive actors. They will not deal with an issue unless the issue is already present. However, this can lead both adversaries and allies to become dissatisfied with the liberal world order. Therefore, policymakers need to seek to preemptively maintain that order. For example, during the 2010s, the Philippines almost broke the US alliance to rapprochement with China. This is because the Philippines perceived the United States not to be holding up its side of the bargain. Instead of this policy of neglect, which led to this problem, the United States should have sought to support the Philippines, specifically in areas of contestation. For example, the United States could have supported the Philippines delimiting and specifying their claims in the South China Sea. Not only would this support have shown the Philippines that the United States was devoted to the alliance, but it also would ensure that today the United States has much stronger ground to stand on when trying to support its ally in a contested area like the South China Sea. Second, if the international order is unstable, as we see right now, then policymakers need to be very careful that great power competition is not the driving force in an intervention. Great power competition has considerable influence on the dynamics of foreign policy. It subsumes everything else. Therefore, policymakers need to decide to intervene for specific and limited goals to avoid small proximal issues from blowing up into unnecessary and costly conflicts. For example, those of you who are looking at the news might know that China is harassing Philippine ships in the South China Sea right now, as the Philippines tries to resupply its base on Second Thomas Shoal. There's a lot of debates about whether the United States should intervene in this conflict. If the United States does, it needs to do so with a very specific and limited aim. For example, the US should intervene with the stated goal of making sure the ships make it from the Philippines to Second Thomas Shoal and back. It should not intervene with the broader goal of winning US-China competition or fixing the South China Sea disputes, because the fate of Second Thomas Shoal, which is essentially an underwater rock, will not actually affect either of those larger issues. This policy recommendation of focused intervention will help the United States avoid overextending itself and blowing small proximal issues that are actually relatively meaningless to US interests into larger conflicts with China. My hope is that policymakers will use these recommendations to have better foreign policy, better statecraft, better manage US-China competition, and ultimately create a more stable world order for us all moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you all for those wonderfully insightful, incredibly thought-provoking presentations. I am going to go right to the audience for questions. Thank you. And I have one if you don't, but I have a feeling there's a number of key questions. So hands up, please. Anya first.
My question is for
Microphone.
Elliot. All right, last time doing this. My question, is it on? Yeah. Okay. My question's for Elliot. So I thought that was really interesting, and it's a 20-year period where we have had three very, very different presidential administrations in the United States. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you saw in terms of differences over time and the effect of differences between administrations.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Professor Bassett. I'm going to give you a really short answer. It was all the Bush administration. Well, not all the Bush administration necessarily. A lot of the sort of rise of PMSCs in American foreign policy making occurred primarily under the Bush administration. So a lot of these issues with control and management and sort of the lag between applicable domestic laws and then the practice abroad occurred under the Bush administration. By the time you get to the Obama administration, so 2008, that's when we start to see, for instance, the Blackwater indictments, and then the Blackwater convictions. I can't say for sure whether or not there's a meaningful difference there. I think that is a very fruitful area for future research in this regard. Just the effects of domestic politics and partisanship on privatization in general, not just in the security sector. So, yeah.
Could you elaborate on how computation propaganda might be different than regular propaganda, why disinformation strategies work for one but not the other?
Yes. So there are many media. Oh, I'm sorry.
Or does Elliot want more time to think through his answer?
No, you go first. You start. I just answered the question. Yeah.
You go, please. I'm begging you.
So, it's hard to say. There's not really any coherent data set or like database of different incidents involving private contractors, especially in the Iraq and Afghan wars. And that being said, like, I think a lot of the awareness that happens around this has to do with media coverage of it. So while these highly visible, kind of scandalous incidents get covered a lot, there's a lot of incidents that were not as visible that had to do with, say, a contractor assaulting a Marine or another contractor shooting the Iraqi vice president's bodyguard. Those incidents didn't garner a ton of media attention, so it's more difficult to sort of say what the total extent is. I think the biggest thing is that there's this massive risk that comes with engaging with private actors in conflict. So when the state empowers private agents to go and use force on its behalf, the risk there is immense. But then again, I think there's just so many avenues for future research in this area, even though there's been so much research done already, just because this is a rapidly evolving area of kind of global contemporary affairs, especially with larger states and democratic states.
So for your question, essentially, my reasoning, like a big portion of my thesis was based on multiple behavioral phenomena. 3 of them, the illusory truth effect, source primacy, and the scroll effect, which is a media studies phenomena, were the primary reasons why computational propaganda functions in a much more violent and much more effective way. So the first behavioral phenomena, illusory truth, essentially says that the more somebody gets exposed to a content, regardless of what the content is, the more believable, cognitive science-wise, they will be likely to believe that content when they next see it. So considering the extent to which and the pace at which bots can produce propaganda, this really distinguishes computational propaganda from traditional propaganda, leaflets, etc., as we traditionally see them. The second effect is the source primacy effect. This suggests that whatever information people hear the first, regardless of what they hear afterwards, they're more likely to believe it, period. As their minds, as the illusory truth effect goes, will be more likely to process it more. It will process it easier. The third effect is the scroll effect. Essentially, people are extremely vulnerable when they're scrolling on TikTok, when they're scrolling on Instagram Reels. They're essentially using a part of their brains that some papers even suggest we only use during dreaming states when we sleep. So this access computational propaganda gives is also a reason why it's so much more different than traditional propaganda. And as to my own interfaces, all of these, like the 2 interfaces I have designed considering these 3 effects. So, yeah.
So great work to all 3 of you. Very impressive research. So all 3 of your studies initially point to shifting of assumed responsibility. So Sophia, you talk about this sort of preemptive responsibility taking by the hegemon. Aisha, this responsibility taking either private industry or government to ensure information accuracy. And Elliot, the shifting of responsibility towards the state rather than the individual for PMSC misconduct. So in each of your cases, what do you see moving forward as the factors that most strongly influence that shifting in responsibility? And potentially how might those compare or differ from the other cases you've seen here today?
So I guess I'll start. Just to clarify, Akshay, do you mean like from shifting from the private sector to the states, or?
So I think in your case, perhaps more, you mentioned the shifting from the individual within departments towards sort of the department as a whole.
Right.
If that makes sense, but happy to clarify further.
Yeah. So I think the tricky thing with the United States case, and I go into this a lot, sort of in the theoretical portions of the thesis, is that, at least in my analysis of it, there's this very, very deeply ingrained norms that are unique and specific to American political culture and political life, and then also American economic life. And those norms resist kind of change. So I think it's difficult to say, like, it's easy to say, yeah, we want sort of a flawless system of management. We want the government to be responsible. But in actuality, that's not necessarily going to ever be the case. It's just so much slips through the cracks already that there are holes that can be patched up, and it's at that sort of federal agency level where those holes could be patched up.
You can go, we can go to So your question in my context really depends on the geographic location where we're discussing this. So also the democratic culture. For example, when you're talking about how big tech, private big tech entities interact with public governmental organizations, in most authoritarian governments, there's already a ministry, full-on ministry, just to interact with and manage these platforms. In Europe, it's a mix. They want to intervene in into their profit models, but they're also intimidated a little. However, in the United States, the premise of an international information war, especially supported by foreign media, big tech organizations, and the considered competition that the US wants to be in them, it seems that it will be the organizations themselves that will eventually be able to take a step. However, one thing going forward that I do believe is an urgent area of intervention regarding big tech entities is how these entities have the power to literally induce foreign interventions by the sheer force of their algorithms, as you mentioned. We have seen this in many countries. Meta is currently going through a trial regarding this. It is these interactions these companies can have nearly as diplomatic entities, states of their own, with other countries, while being based in the US, that should be considered and regulated. Yeah, I hope that was...
I just realized my name tag is still over there. Could I have it back so I am a named individual? Thank you. So I don't think, in terms of my study, it's a question of responsibility. I mean, who's a responsible state? That's a whole another thesis in the making. But I think it's more of who's taking initiative. When you look at United States and China, for a while it was China changing how it's approaching international politics, its relationship with other countries. And the United States didn't consider China a threat enough to really take the initiative to make true action, especially as we see during the 2000s when the United States was somewhat still convinced or very reluctant to let go of the idea that it could subsume China through cultural engagement, economic engagement. We really don't see a mindset shift until around 2010s, and even then they still held on to that hope that China would suddenly decide that democracy is the way to go. But as the United States has been forced to acknowledge that China is here to stay, it has its own goals, the initiative has really fallen on the United States to change the way it approaches China to protect the United States' interests.
Tony over here. Yes. We've got time for one more after this, if anybody wants to throw their hand up.
Thank you all for really, really interesting presentations. A quick question to Elliot. I mean, the cynic in me wants to say, if you looked at the Wagner group in Russia and said, what is this about? You might come to the conclusion, well, the use of private military contractors is precisely, in some sense, to blur the lines of accountability and make it unclear who's responsible for what. And I'm just wondering how you think that argument might play out in the American context.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I think it's a little different in the American context, specifically with regards to the rise of contracting in general. Just like in the kind of Cold War victory moment of the 1990s, you have this huge reduction in sort of the total personnel of many federal agencies, many international facing federal agencies. So I think it was sort of this push in the 90s that sort of just snowballed in the early 2000s, and then global war of terror starts. Suddenly the United States military, or the United States sort of hawkish security policymaking establishment, decides we need to have massive military interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, but our capabilities have been gutted since the end of the Cold War. Okay, what should we do, or what can we do? And so I think it's sort of a combination of like trying to fill that capacity gap, and then also just, I think it comes back to those embedded American norms on the American right, especially, that privatization is good, outsourcing is good, less government involvement in policymaking is good, private sector handles everything better. Whereas the Wagner Group, I think that's it's a whole other can of worms. Different, but similar. Yeah.
Lyle.
Yeah, thanks. Wonderful job to all the presenters here. Well, basic question for all of you, and then maybe a specific question to my great advisee, Sophia. It strikes me that all of you are trying to kind of address some sort of major gap in U.S. government policy making. So, I wonder, do you come away from this experience of writing a thesis sort of more optimistic? I know you all have great suggestions, policy recommendations, so forth, but are you, your bottom line, do you feel positive about that the problem has been fixed, or is being fixed? On the South China Sea, I did miss all those colorful maps. I think that's the first South China Sea presentation I've seen without all the wonderful zigzag lines everywhere. But my question to you, Sophia, and I suppose it's fair to answer this by saying, well, that's out of bounds, Professor Goldstein, but to me, a lot of the thesis focuses on, as you said, the hegemon's sort of complacency and sort of waking up. At the same time, though, as we've sort of discussed, but there is that question lingering out there of Chinese motives. And I realize that was not the area you focused on for very legitimate reasons, but when you come out of the thesis experience, do you contend that this is, fundamentally kind of an aggressive pattern of Chinese behavior, with sort of offensive, expansionist intent, or do you see it as more a kind of interaction of, say, like the security dilemma? Again, I understand that the thesis was focused on U.S. Policy making. Thanks to the whole group.
Should I go first and answer both questions?
Do you want to go first, Sophia?
Okay.
And show him how it's done here, please.
Okay. I'll save the optimism question for all of us. But Chinese motives, 我在中文说或者在英文说. I think that it is a mix of desire to expand, but also a security dilemma. So when I talked to experts at the Naval War College, a lot of them talked about a combination of, China always believing that the South China Sea is, its territory, combined with its concern about U.S. presence, U.S. encirclement, U.S. containment in East Asia. So China fundamentally feels it was robbed of a lot of the territory in the South China Sea by the 100 years of humiliation, by, isolation by the United States. Reclaiming the South China Sea and all lost territories, including, of course, Taiwan, is part of China's dream, or Xi Jinping's promoted Chinese dream. So I do think there is some, I don't know if aggressive is the right word, but a determined effort to reclaim that. Simultaneously, I think as China wants to reclaim its position, it was the hegemon, regional hegemon, in East Asia for most of its history. As it's seeking to reclaim that, it knows that the United States being present in East Asia is necessary, a roadblock to that, and that there is a danger that the more it expands, the more likely it is going to run into problems with the United States, with U.S. allies. Every time China worries Japan, South Korea, increasingly the Philippines, there is that risk that something could go wrong, and the United States will come in, the giant that it is, still for now, and make a mess of it. So I think that both those things are in Chinese consideration, but of course there's a nice asterisk here. My Chinese is not good enough to read directly, foreign ministry publications. I also, unfortunately, like most scholars, do not have access to Chinese communist backroom papers. I would love that. I think all of us would. So I don't know exactly, but I do believe that both are present. Now let's go to the optimism question, because that's much happier. You guys go.
I think your question calls on a dichotomy in U.S. policy in general regarding how the United States treats its foreign policy versus internal policy. So first of all, it's really interesting to see right now, there's obviously a scientific information warfare going on regarding these new innovations that are significantly changing and reshaping media as we think it is, AI being one. It's already integrated into our lives. However, we know very little of the effects of it. One thing interesting to note is that in terms of what U.S. agencies are researching this, in terms of what agencies within the United States state are honing on this is, first of all, foreign psyops, that mission as a whole has been the primary publisher of papers and new information regarding computational propaganda so far. So what does this mean? The US does have a history of information interventions to foreign states overall. However, while currently, again, the US is incredibly fast to adapt this to a foreign intervention or military capability perspective, it is striking to see how much they can implement that care and effort towards their internal policy, towards protecting their own citizens from this threat. So in terms of, so we can divide this question into two sides of US policy, one military, one internal, social rather. Military-wise, this situation will change how foreign interventions are conducted by the United States, for sure. Their papers suggest so. Multiple papers acknowledge it as a valid working method that can change foreign public opinions. However, regarding what Congress wants to do and how fast they act in terms of how to protect the American public, I'm not very optimistic, especially considering, I mean, free market is a core American tenet, right? And we're currently seeing this in interesting state in the free market ideology that the market can outdo, the market can act like a diplomatic power in its own. However, I'm not very optimistic regarding how much they will want to regulate that private entity. I think this also connects to Ellie's presentation regarding private military organizations. But yeah.
Do you want to go?
Yeah, sort of a surprising answer, I guess, but overall, trend line is optimistic, metaphorically. But yeah, I feel optimistic simply because the global war on terrors, but specifically the American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, had so many incidents, not only of private military companies, private contractors engaging in abuses, but also of just U.S. military personnel engaging in abuses. So yeah, I think overall at least on that side, from the domestic public awareness side, optimistic. Internationally, not so sure. I mean, I think that remains to be seen. The United States isn't currently embroiled in large-scale military intervention anywhere, but some of its closer allies are. And I guess we'll have to see what happens, honestly. But I also think there's certain conditions that were just unique to kind of the Bush era, and the shock of 9/11, the sort of overwhelming response after that, this rush to get involved in these external foreign wars against terror without doing anything domestically to sort of prepare the U.S. federal government apparatus for that. So that's a non-answer, I guess, but there you go.
And then, I feel like I'm optimistic about the United States' ability currently to deter China in certain aspects. I went into this pretty worried about the United States' ability to bring force to bear to continue to deter China in, geographic locations that are increasingly far-flung. And talking to subject matter experts from the Naval War Institute did not make me feel more optimistic about it. They were quite concerned about that. But having read about how the United States has handled certain standoffs, incidents in the South China Sea, specifically thinking about Second Thomas Shoal 2014, and of course Scarborough Shoal 2016, and the ways that the United States handled that, I think I'm pretty optimistic about that, at least in terms of avoiding conflict. When the United States does bring force to bear, it has done so in ways that are quite well balanced, I would say, in my opinion. They have not been overly risky. Of course, they have brought that threat that leaves something to chance in there, but they have not done so recklessly. And China so far has shown that it is not quite ready yet to engage the United States in a conflict over Taiwan or the South China Sea. So that's optimistic. What I'm less optimistic about is some of the mindsets that I read about, that I saw being enacted in various policies. The Cold War naturally looms large in discussions of U.S.-China competition. How could it not? There's been no, competition like, the Cold War, two nuclear powers, two incredibly robust economies, two differing ideological systems. But I'm always cautious about applying the mindsets that drove the last Cold War, determined our policy during the last Cold War, to modern politics. China, as Hillary Clinton once said, is not the Soviet Union. And I think that treating it like another Soviet Union, and applying that same, mindset of not one more inch, not now, it does not work in the modern world and will only lead to economic competition, which was disastrous in 2020 when the United States tried that, or even, proxy wars, which, as Elliot pointed out, the United States does not seem very prepared for. So I am also mixed in terms of my optimism.
Well, thank Professor Goldstein for not having me ask the last question, because that was much better than mine. Yes, no joking. And to start, as we close pretty quickly here, please join me in thanking Sophia, Aicha, and Elliot, and congratulating them. And then hold your applause. Your hands are going to get sore here in a second. If you're an honors thesis student, IAPA concentrator who's going to graduate with honors still in the room here, please rise. For 1 second, we want to acknowledge you. And before you applaud, I want you to think about the ordeal, the trials, the tribulations that you went through as you considered, yeah, you should stand up as well. All rise. Think about all of the decision-making and the advice you sought. Think about last summer. Think about really second semester junior year as you started to solidify the decision-making process. Think about the people that helped you along the journey. And then I want to recognize, and we'll applaud here in a second, the time commitment, the sacrifices that you made. Maybe or maybe not spring break. I know some of you went on spring break still. But really, no kidding. This is a massive undertaking. This is a significant, serious milestone in your life, and I hope you'll take a minute to reflect on the process, not just the end product and the briefs you got to give over the last 2 days, but the process and how this will carry you forward, and hopefully solving complex world problems when you leave here. So thank you for undertaking this. And then you can sit back down if you'd like. And it would be really remiss of me if I didn't acknowledge and thank Anya, Anita, Claudia, Sandy, Jordan, and many others who make this process occur behind the scenes year after year after year. So a round of applause for our faculty and staff. And then thanks to Alexandra, who's still sitting here. I got to audible and change my ending based on a quote that you said, and I hope I got this right. So I think you said, how we tell our past directly shapes our future. So that was a quote that you gave. So I would say a great thing about Brown is whether you're doing a capstone or an honors thesis, how we study, research, analyze, and write about our past can help us improve and shape our future. And that's what this is about. So thank you for letting me steal your quote, all right, and modifying it slightly. But that's what this is about. And then I'll just end with a reminder that at the Watson Institute, we seek to promote a just and peaceful world through research, teaching, and public engagement. And I don't know if there's a better tool to do that than the honors thesis process. So a round of applause for everybody involved, and thank you.